Get off my platform! Edna Marsh's voice cut through the noise of Black Ridge Station like a slap. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull Margaret Ellis aside with some pretense of privacy. She said it loud enough for every person on that platform to hear. The fur-coated women clutching their bags, the ranch hands leaning against the wall, the station master pretending to sort papers he'd already sorted twice. Margaret stood completely still. Snow had started falling again, catching in her gray hair, melting against the back of her neck. "I wrote you," Margaret said. Her voice was steady, but barely. "You wrote back. You said there was work." "I said a lot of things." Edna didn't even look at her directly. She looked at the people watching instead, as though performing for them. "That was before I found out who you really are. If you've ever been publicly humiliated by someone who once promised to help you, if you've ever stood somewhere with nowhere to go while the people around you turned away, then stay with me. This story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and hit like if Margaret's journey moves you. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that platform. Let's go back to Margaret Ellis standing in the snow. What? The train had been 4 hours late out of Helena, delayed by a stretch of frozen track that the railroad company hadn't bothered to fix before December set in hard. Margaret had spent those 4 hours sitting upright in a third-class car that smelled of wet wool and coal smoke, her suitcase wedged between her feet because there was no space in the overhead rack. The woman beside her had fallen asleep against the window and snored with remarkable consistency. The man across the aisle had eaten salt pork from a cloth wrapper and offered her none. She hadn't minded any of it, not really. She had ridden worse. She had sat in worse silences. What she kept thinking about, through the rattle and the cold and the slow creep of the Montana plains outside the frosted glass, was the letter. She had memorized it by now, though she hadn't meant to. The position is for a seamstress and general household aide, with possibility of expanded duties depending on fit. We are a growing settlement and have need of experienced, capable women. Room and meals provided. Please come as soon as circumstances allow. Experienced? Capable. That was what the letter said. That was what Edna Marsh had written to her in September, back when Margaret was still sleeping on her cousin's parlor floor in Bozeman, trying to figure out what came next after 58 years of a life that had not gone the way she'd planned any of it. She'd written back within the week. She'd been honest in her reply, honest about her age, honest about her experience, honest about the fact that she came with a certain amount of history attached to her name. She hadn't hidden it. She'd thought that was the right thing to do. Apparently, it had not been. The train slowed into Black Ridge Station with the particular groan of machinery that has been pushed too hard in cold weather. Margaret stood, straightened her coat, pulled her gloves on. She lifted her suitcase, the old brown one with the brass latches that her husband Thomas had bought for their honeymoon trip 26 years ago, and she moved toward the door with the 12 other passengers climbing off at this stop. She stepped onto the platform, and the cold hit her like a door swung open against her face. Blackridge wasn't much. She'd expected that. A low wooden station building, a water tower that had a crack running up one side, a main street visible through the gap between structures, maybe 30 yards of it, a handful of storefronts, a livery stable at the far end. The mountains behind the town were enormous and close and white. The sky above them was the particular shade of gray that meant more snow before nightfall. She looked for Edna Marsh, whom she'd never met in person. The letter had described her as the proprietor of a boarding house and small dry goods operation on the main street. Margaret had imagined a stout woman, practical, no nonsense, someone who ran a tight operation and valued competent help. She found her standing at the edge of the platform with two other women Margaret didn't know. Both younger, both dressed considerably better than the occasion warranted, both watching the arriving passengers with the particular expression of people who have come to observe something rather than participate in it. Margaret lifted her hand. "Mrs. Marsh?" Edna Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that Margaret started to wonder if she had the wrong person. Then something shifted in the woman's face. Something that wasn't recognition so much as confirmation of a suspicion. And that was when she said it. "Get off my platform." The words landed in the cold air, and Margaret felt them the way you feel a stumble, The lurch, the reaching for something to hold on to, the split second before you understand whether you've fallen or caught yourself. I beg your pardon? You heard me. Edna Marsh stepped forward now, close enough that Margaret could smell her perfume, something floral and too heavy for a train platform in December. I know who you are. Margaret Ellis. I had a letter from Phyllis Crane in Helena last month. She told me everything. Margaret kept her voice as level as she could manage. I don't know what Phyllis Crane told you, but I can assure you, she told me about the money. Edna's chin went up. She told me about your husband's debts and the way you handled his estate and the trouble with his brother's family. She said you were not a woman of good character. That is not what happened. Margaret's grip tightened on the handle of the suitcase. Thomas's brother made accusations that were never proven because there was nothing to prove. I handled the estate as honestly as I knew how, and I have witnesses who will— I don't need witnesses. Edna Marsh stepped back, as though proximity to Margaret was itself a kind of contamination. I need a woman I can trust in my establishment, and that is not you. I'm sorry you made the trip. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded satisfied. The two women with her said nothing, but Margaret could feel the other passengers nearby. The ones who hadn't gone inside yet, who were still collecting their bags or waiting for someone to meet them, and she understood that she had just been displayed, presented and rejected in public, made into a small spectacle for a gray Tuesday afternoon. Mrs. Marsh— Margaret made herself say it calmly, though there was something trembling now behind her breastbone, something she'd been holding down for a long time. I have nowhere else to go. Edna Marsh looked at her for one more second. Then she turned and walked away. Just like that. Heels on the wooden platform, the two women following, not looking back once. Margaret stood where she was. The snow kept falling. A porter walked past her with a cart, glanced at her, looked away. Two men near the station doors had lowered their voices but were still clearly talking about something, and she was fairly certain it was her. A woman in a blue coat had watched the whole exchange and now made a point of moving her children to the other side of the platform, away from Margaret, as though whatever Margaret had was something they might catch. She picked up her suitcase. She carried it to the far end of the platform where there was a wooden bench, and she sat down on it and she looked out at the road that ran from the station into the main street of Blackridge. It was empty. The wind came across it in small gusts that sent loose snow spiraling up from the ground. The last train of the day was the one she'd arrived on. She already knew that. She'd asked twice in Helena because she hadn't wanted to get stranded, and both times she'd been told the afternoon train from Blackridge back east didn't run this time of year. The line was reduced in winter. The next eastbound train was Thursday. It was Tuesday. She thought about the money in her purse, $12.40, which had seemed reasonable for the trip when she left Bozeman because she'd expected to arrive somewhere she was wanted. She counted it in her head. 2 nights somewhere, if somewhere would take her. Food for 2 days, and then Thursday she could leave and go back to her cousin Viola's parlor floor and figure out what came next, again, at 58 years old, for what felt like the 100th time. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time. She'd noticed that about herself a few years back, that she'd gone past the crying part of grief and come out the other side into something harder and less satisfying. Crying would have been almost a relief. Instead, she sat there and felt the bench beneath her and the cold through her coat, and she thought, this is where you are. Now figure out what you do next. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when she heard the sound she'd stopped expecting. Hoofbeats. A horse and rider came around the side of the station from the direction of the road, moving at an easy pace despite the snow. The horse was a big gray animal, steady and calm. The rider was a man somewhere in his early 50s, she guessed, tall in the saddle, wearing a heavy canvas coat and a hat that had seen genuine weather. He had a kind of physical stillness about him that Margaret recognized from men who spent most of their lives outdoors, not the stillness of someone relaxed, but the stillness of someone whose body had learned how to conserve itself. He brought the horse to a stop near the hitching post at the end of the platform. He swung down without apparent difficulty and tied the reins. Then he walked up onto the platform and went into the station, and Margaret assumed that was the end of it. But 3 minutes later he came back out, and this time he stopped. He stopped and looked at her, not the glancing look she'd been getting for the past half hour, the kind that slid away the moment eyes met. He actually looked, the way you look when you're trying to understand something. You come in on the afternoon train? He asked. Yes? You waiting on someone? She almost said yes. It would have been the easier answer. No, she said instead. He looked at the suitcase. Then he looked back at her. You got somewhere to stay tonight? The direct question caught her off guard. She'd been bracing for more of the sideways treatment she'd been getting, the looking past her, the careful distance. A direct question felt almost aggressive by comparison. I'm working on it, she said. He looked at her with an expression that suggested he could see exactly how well that was going. Blackridge has got one boarding house, he said. You already know who runs it. She looked at him carefully. You saw that. Half the town saw it. He said it without judgment, just as a fact. Edna Marsh runs a boarding house, and she runs that platform like it's her personal property. Everybody who comes through here knows to let her have her opinion. He paused. Doesn't make it right. Margaret studied him. He had a weathered face, the kind that had spent decades in sun and wind, and his eyes were a very light gray blue that was almost colorless in the flat winter light. There were deep lines around them. He looked like a man who had had hard years, and she'd lived long enough to know the difference between a man who'd been hardened by hard years and one who'd been broken by them. This one had not been broken. I'm Caleb Whitmore, he said. I run a cattle ranch about 6 miles north. I come in for supplies. Margaret Ellis. I know, he said. I heard. She waited for the rest of it, for the version she'd been hearing all afternoon. He said nothing else. He just looked at her for a moment more, and then he said, I have an empty room. Margaret looked at him for a long time. You don't know anything about me. I know you've been sitting on that bench in the cold for 20 minutes, and the temperature's going to drop another 10 degrees before dark. He wasn't being unkind about it. He wasn't being kind either, exactly. He was just being matter of fact. Room's empty, there's food, I've got a ranch hand and my daughter, and that's it right now. It's nothing fancy. Mr. Whitmore. She made herself say the practical thing, the thing you had to say when a stranger offered you something that sounded too simple. You're offering a room to a woman you just watched get turned away in public. That doesn't concern you? People get turned away in public for all kinds of reasons, he said. Some of them deserve it, some of them don't. He untied his horse's reins. I've met Phyllis Crane once in my life at a stockman's dinner in Helena 2 winters back. She spent the whole evening making sure everybody at the table knew she'd sat next to the governor at some event or other. That's the woman who wrote Edna Marsh a letter about your character. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung up. You coming or not? It was not the most gracious offer she'd ever received, but it was the only one on the table. Margaret picked up her suitcase and stood. She had to ask him to slow down while she walked around to where the wagon was. He had a wagon tied at the side of the building that she hadn't seen from the bench, and she had to accept his hand to climb up onto the seat, which she gave him credit for offering without ceremony. She settled her suitcase at her feet. He clicked to the horse, and they moved away from the station and out onto the road. Neither of them said anything for a few minutes. The snow had started to fall more steadily now. The town moved past them on either side. A hardware store, a saloon, a small building with a sign that said Telegraph and Post. A woman watching them from a doorway who quickly looked away when Margaret caught her eye. Your daughter, Margaret said. How old? 10, Caleb said. She live with you full time? Always has. He said it in a way that wasn't unfriendly, but was clearly the end of that particular thread. Margaret looked at the road ahead of them. The mountains were larger now, closer, filling the horizon. You said the room is empty. It wasn't always empty. He didn't answer right away. The horse moved steadily through the snow, and the silence lasted long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer at all. My wife died 4 years ago, he said. Fever. Took her fast. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who has recounted a terrible thing enough times that the recounting has become procedural. Room was hers. The whole house was hers, really. She had opinions about how things ought to be done. He paused. Hasn't been used much since then. Margaret said, I'm sorry. 4 years, he said again, as though that were a response, and she supposed it was. They rode in silence for another mile. The road climbed slightly, following the contour of the land as it rose toward the mountains. The wind picked up. Margaret thought about what she was doing. She thought about it with the part of her brain that had kept her practical through things that might have undone someone less stubborn, through Thomas's long illness and the months of nursing him, through the fight with Thomas's brother Robert about the estate, through the year of whispers in their town back in Missouri that had made it impossible to stay, through the slow, grinding process of dismantling a life and trying to carry the essential parts of it west in a brown suitcase. She was getting into a wagon with a man she didn't know and riding 6 miles from a town she didn't know toward a ranch she'd never seen, at 58 years old, because the alternative was the bench in the cold. She thought, this is what it comes to. And then she thought, well, you've made worse decisions. At least this one has food attached to it. She didn't know then what Whitmore Ranch would look like when they arrived. The long approach through the snow, the low stone and timber buildings that hunkered into the landscape like they'd grown there, the smoke from the main house chimney moving sideways in the wind. She didn't know she'd step down from the wagon and have a small girl appear at the doorway of the house, a child with her father's eyes and her mother's unreachable grief, and look at her with an expression that was equal parts hope and wariness. She didn't know that she'd stand in that doorway and feel something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Not happiness, exactly. Not safety. Something quieter than that. The sensation of a door that wasn't being shut in her face. What she knew, riding in the wagon through the snow, was only what she'd been carrying for the past several years. The knowledge that she was older than most people's idea of useful. That she was a woman who'd been stamped with someone else's story and had not yet found the words to write her own. That she had $12.40 and a suitcase and a lifetime of skills that the world kept finding reasons to tell her it didn't need. And then, beneath all of that, stubborn and persistent, the way certain things are that refuse to be snuffed out no matter how many times the wind blows, something that she didn't have a name for exactly. Not hope. Something prior to hope. Something that had been keeping her upright through all of it without her full permission. She held the side of the wagon seat as they rounded a curve in the road. The ranch came into view ahead of them through the snow. Caleb slowed the horse. "It's not much," he said. "You keep saying that," she said. "Keep meaning it." "Well," Margaret said, looking at the buildings coming toward them through the white, the smoke from the chimney, the light in the window that meant someone had lit a lamp against the early dark. "I've learned not to judge things by what they look like when you first see them." He glanced at her from the side. Just briefly, and for a moment she thought he might actually smile. Not a wide smile, nothing demonstrative, just a slight change at the corners of his mouth that on another face might have been nothing at all. He pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and stopped. He climbed down. He didn't offer her his hand this time, which was either an oversight or a sign that he'd decided she didn't need it, and she decided to take it as the second thing. She climbed down herself, landed solidly, picked up her suitcase. The door of the house opened and Clara Whitmore stood there, 10 years old, watching her with those gray eyes that saw more than they gave back. "Papa," she said. "Who is that?" "This is Mrs. Ellis," Caleb said. "She's going to be staying with us a while." Clara looked at Margaret, looked at the suitcase, looked back at her father. "How long is a while?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Caleb said. "Does it matter?" Clara thought about this with the seriousness that children give to questions adults have dismissed as simple. "No," she said finally. "I guess not." She stepped back from the door. "There's stew on the stove. I made too much anyway." She walked back inside and left the door open. Margaret looked at the open door. She looked at the warm light coming from it, the smell of something cooking. Simple food, nothing elaborate, but real. She thought about the bench at the station. She thought about Edna Marsh's heels on the platform. Then she walked through the door, and behind her, the snow kept falling on Blackridge Station, on the empty bench at the end of the platform, on the last place anyone had made her feel unwanted. The wind swept across it and the snow kept piling up, and by morning you couldn't have told that anyone had sat there at all. The stew was venison. Margaret figured that out before she'd finished her first bowl. The particular dark richness of it, the way the meat pulled apart rather than cut, The juniper berries someone had added that gave it a flavor she hadn't tasted since years back when Thomas used to hunt. She didn't say any of this. She ate without comment and was grateful for the heat of it moving through her. Clara sat across the table and watched her eat with the unself-conscious directness that children have before they learn it's rude. Caleb sat at the head of the table and ate steadily and said nothing. A ranch hand named Duff Alcott had come in from the barn just before supper, a lean, weathered man in his mid-40s with a permanent squint from years of looking into wind and sun, and he'd stopped dead in the doorway when he saw Margaret at the table. He'd looked at Caleb. Caleb had looked back at him with an expression that said everything and required no discussion. Duff had sat down and taken his bowl and said, "Evening," to Margaret without ceremony, and that had been that. The stove was the best thing in the room. It was a large iron range, well-maintained, throwing heat with real seriousness. The rest of the main room was functional without being comfortable. A table that had been built for more people than currently used it, chairs that didn't match, a shelf on the far wall holding a row of leather-bound ledgers, and a few tools that had been set there and not returned to where they belonged. The floor was swept, but the corners hadn't been touched in a while. There was a coat rack by the door with a woman's coat still hanging on it, gray wool, small enough that it had belonged to someone shorter than Caleb. 4 years, and nobody had moved it. Margaret did not look at it more than once. After supper, Clara stood and started stacking bowls without being asked. Margaret rose to help, and Clara glanced at her sidelong. "You don't have to." "I know," Margaret said. She picked up the pot and carried it to the wash basin anyway. Clara watched her for a moment. "Do you know how to cook other things? Papa can only make 3 things, and one of them is just bread, and one of them is just coffee." "Clara," Caleb said, "it's true." "I know it's true. You don't need to inform Mrs. Ellis on her first night. She's going to find out anyway." Clara handed Margaret a bowl to wash with the efficiency of someone who has been doing domestic work since before she was tall enough to reach the counter comfortably. "Do you know how to make pie?" "I do," Margaret said. "What kind?" "Depends on what's available. Apple, usually. Dried fruit in winter." Clara considered this. "We have dried apples," she said, as though this were a significant piece of information that changed the calculus of something. "Papa won't let me use the oven by myself because of the time I burned my arm." She held up her left forearm briefly, where there was a faint scar Margaret hadn't noticed until now. "It was 2 years ago. I think he's going to hold it against me forever." "That's not why," Caleb said from the table. He hadn't moved to help with the washing up. "You're not tall enough to pull a hot pan from the back of that oven safely. When you're taller, you can use it." "Then why did you tell Duff it was because of the burn?" Duff, from the corner near the window where he was mending a piece of harness, said nothing and made a point of it. "Finish the dishes," Caleb said. Margaret washed and Clara dried, and neither of them spoke again for a few minutes. The silence in the house was of a particular kind. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of people who have gotten used to absence and learned to move around it. She'd lived in that kind of silence herself. She recognized its specific weight. "Papa said you're a seamstress," Clara said eventually. "Was. Among other things." "What other things?" "Clara." This from Caleb, the warning note clear. "It's all right," Margaret said. She handed the pot to Clara to dry. "I nursed the sick for a while after my husband passed. Helped a doctor in the town where I lived. Before that, I ran a small alterations shop out of my home. Before that, I helped my husband with his accounts when his eyes started going." She paused. "I've done most things at some point." Clara dried the pot with great thoroughness. "Why did you come here if you didn't know anyone?" Margaret looked at the window above the wash basin. Outside it was fully dark now, the snow visible in the wedge of lamplight that fell through the glass. "I had a letter," she said. "Someone who said there was work." "Mrs. Marsh." "You know her?" "Everybody knows her." Clara set the pot down. "She said you were trouble. She was talking about it at the dry goods store this afternoon. I heard her when Papa went to get the flour." She looked up at Margaret with the gray eyes that were her father's eyes in a younger face. "Are you trouble?" Margaret thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't believe so," she said, "but I've been told I am enough times that I sometimes have trouble remembering who to believe." Clara absorbed this. Papa gets called trouble too sometimes, she said, by Mr. Fenwick at the bank. He says Papa is difficult. Is he? Yes, Clara said matter-of-factly, but being difficult isn't the same as being bad. From the table, Caleb made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been something he'd swallowed wrong. Duff folded his mending, stood, said, "Night," to the room in general, and went out the back to the bunkhouse. Margaret dried her hands. "I'd like to see the room," she said to Caleb. "If that's all right." He pushed back his chair. He picked up the lamp from the table and led her down the short hallway to the left of the main room. There were 3 doors. He opened the last one. The room was small. A bed with a frame made of rough-cut timber. A mattress that looked like it had been remade recently with clean ticking. She noticed that and understood what it meant. That he'd prepared this before leaving for town this afternoon. A washstand with a pitcher and basin. A single window facing north. A hook on the back of the door, and a small shelf beside it that held nothing. It was almost entirely bare, not because it had always been bare, but because the things that had been in it had been removed, carefully and not recently, and what was left was a room waiting to be something again. She didn't say any of this. "It does fine," she said. "Thank you." He handed her the lamp. "There's a stove in the main room that keeps the hall warm. Should be enough." He paused in the doorway. "Breakfast is early, 5:30. You don't need to—" "I'll be up," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said, and then he pulled the door closed behind him. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. She set the lamp on the floor because there was nowhere else to put it. She looked at the room. She had not unpacked. She noticed that. Her suitcase was on the floor, and she'd taken nothing out of it. In every place she'd stayed since Thomas died. Viola's parlor, the boarding house in Bozeman, for the 3 weeks she'd had the seamstress job before the shop closed, the one night she'd spent in a room above a saloon in a town whose name she'd already mostly forgotten. She had never fully unpacked. She always left the suitcase ready, always kept the essential things accessible. She looked at the case for a while. Then she reached down and unlatched it and took out her nightgown. Just that. One thing. She hung it on the hook on the back of the door. It was the first thing she had hung on a hook that belonged to her since she'd left Missouri. She didn't let herself make too much of it, but she noticed it. The next morning she was up before 5. She was up before Caleb, which she could tell because the house was entirely silent and the stove in the main room had burned down to coals that needed building up. She did that first, feeding it small pieces of wood until it caught, then larger ones, then moving to the kitchen to figure out what was in this house that could be made into breakfast. What was in the house was dried beans, salt pork, the remaining dried apples, cornmeal, a small quantity of real flour. Eggs, from what she guessed, was a very small number of chickens given the quantity, coffee, and a collection of canned goods whose labels were in some cases difficult to read. She found a piece of salt pork, started it in the pan, made cornmeal porridge because the pan she needed for eggs was under it, put the coffee on, and had most of it ready when she heard boots in the hallway. Caleb came in and stopped. He looked at the stove. He looked at the table where she'd set out bowls. He looked at her. "I wasn't sure what you had," she said. "I should have asked. I used the salt pork." "That's fine." He sat down slowly, like someone still working out whether he was awake. He accepted the coffee she put in front of him with both hands around the mug. He didn't say thank you immediately. He drank about half of it first. "Clara eat before school?" Margaret asked. "She has to be out by 7:15. Neighbor takes her in the wagon with his kids. There's a school in town, small." "What time does she get up?" "Usually I have to wake her. She won't thank you for it." "Noted." Duff came in at 5:25, looked at the food on the table, looked at Caleb, and sat down without comment. He ate 2 full bowls of the porridge and drank his coffee and said, when he stood up to leave, "That's better than anything we've had in a month." After he left, Caleb said, "He's not wrong." "I assumed as much," Margaret said. She sat down with her own bowl across from him, the way she'd positioned herself at supper, not at the end of the table, not at the corner, across from him, which was a specific choice, and she knew it. "Tell me what needs doing on the ranch." He looked up from his coffee. "You said there was a room and food," she said. "You didn't say I was a guest. I didn't come here to be a guest. I didn't ask you to work for me." I know you didn't. I'm asking. She met his eyes directly. She'd noticed he responded to directness. The sideways approach didn't suit him. I have skills that are useful. I can see already that this house needs things. I'm not going to sit in that room and feel like a burden until Thursday and the next train. So tell me what needs doing. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. Not irritation, not the suspicion she'd half expected. Something else. Something that looked almost like relief but guarded. Like he'd learned to hold relief at a distance. The hay barn has a section of wall that needs the gaps chinked before the serious cold sets in, he said. Duff and I haven't gotten to it. Cattle need checking twice a day. I do that. There's a breeding record I've been behind on for 2 months. And the house... He stopped. The house, she said. Clara does what she can, he said. She's 10. Duff won't touch anything inside. He said it without judgment, just fact. I do what I remember to do. Margaret looked around the main room with the eyes she'd been holding back since last night. The swept floor and the uncleaned corners. The lamp chimney that needed polishing. The curtains at the window that were faded and missing a hook at one end so they hung crooked. The shelf with the ledgers and the tools and a layer of fine dust over all of it. Show me the breeding record after breakfast, she said. I kept my husband's accounts for 6 years. Livestock records aren't so different. He looked at her. You're going to stay, he said. It wasn't a question exactly, but it also wasn't entirely a statement. For now, she said, if that's still all right. I told you the room wasn't temporary. You told me you had an empty room, she said. Those are different things. He considered this. He drank the rest of his coffee. He said, fair enough. And then he got up and went to the shelf and brought back a ledger that had seen significant use, its cover soft and bent at the corners, and he set it on the table in front of her. She opened it and looked at the records inside, but dates, cattle numbers, bull designations, notes in handwriting that had started neat and gotten rougher over the years until the last pages were barely legible. There was a gap, a significant gap. From about 3 years back, the records got sparse, and from 2 years back, they were nearly non-existent. She looked up at him. I know, he said. She didn't push it. She knew what 2 years back meant in this house. She'd seen the coat on the rack. She found an empty page near the end of the ledger and picked up the pen that was lying in the crease of the spine and said, sit down and tell me what I don't have in here and I'll start filling it in. Caleb sat back down. He looked at the open ledger for a moment. Then he started talking. The gaps in those records took them most of the morning to fill, and by the time they'd finished, Margaret had a reasonable picture of the ranch's situation. 240 head of cattle, decent breeding stock, 3 horses beyond Caleb's gray, a hay supply that was adequate but not generous, a grazing situation that worked in mild winters and became a problem in hard ones. Financially, the ranch was what she would have called cautious, not prosperous, not desperate, somewhere in the careful middle that required constant attention to stay there. She asked questions, and he answered them, and she noticed that he answered them fully. He didn't shorten things for her. He didn't assume she wouldn't understand the cattle end of it. He just answered what she asked, and she asked sensible questions because she'd been paying attention to ranchers and their operations for years back in Missouri, and by the end he was looking at her with something that was starting to resemble respect, or at least its preliminary form. Clara came through the main room at 7 and stopped dead when she saw the 2 of them at the table surrounded by the open ledger and Margaret's notes. What are you doing? She asked. Records, Caleb said. You never do records in the morning. Mrs. Ellis is helping. Clara looked at Margaret, then at the ledger, then at her father. Did you eat breakfast? I ate. He usually forgets, Clara told Margaret. He'll say he ate, but sometimes he just had coffee. I had 2 bowls, Caleb said. Go get your coat. Clara went to get her coat. She came back wearing it incorrectly buttoned, and Margaret almost said something and then didn't because it wasn't her place. Not yet, not 3 hours in. Clara grabbed her school bag from the hook by the door and went out into the cold morning, and through the window they heard the sound of the neighbor's wagon pulling up and then pulling away. The house was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet than it had been the night before. Margaret noticed that. Something had shifted in it, barely perceptible, the way a room changes when a window is opened even a small amount. She told herself not to make too much of it. The trouble from town arrived 3 days later, which was sooner than she'd expected and later than she'd feared. She was in the barn working on a tear in one of the ranch hand's coats. Duff had a second coat that had been living on a nail for months, waiting for someone to fix the shoulder seam that had come apart. When she heard horses on the road and then voices outside, she kept working. She'd learned early that the smartest response to potential trouble was to stay put and look occupied. The voices were Caleb's and another man's, and the other man was not being quiet about whatever he had to say. She heard the name Marsh. She heard the word reputation. She heard the phrase that people around here have long memories, which was the kind of thing people said when they wanted to make a threat sound like a weather forecast. She focused on the needle and the thick canvas of the coat and the line of stitches she was laying in. After a while, the second voice went away. She heard one set of hoofbeats leaving. Caleb came into the barn 10 minutes later. He stood and looked at her sewing for a moment. "Who was that?" she asked, though she had a sense of it already. "Tom Hensley. He owns the feed store. He's also Edna Marsh's brother-in-law, which accounts for some of the visit." He leaned against one of the stall doors with his arms crossed. His expression was the controlled one, the one that didn't give much away. "He wanted to let me know that some people in town are saying that I've made a poor decision bringing you out here, that it reflects badly on the ranch's character." He paused. That was more or less the whole of it. Margaret kept her eyes on her work. "And what did you say?" "I told him I appreciated him coming out in the cold to share it with me." She looked up. "That's all?" "I also told him that I'd be in on Friday for supplies as usual, and I'd expect his prices to be the same as they've always been." He paused again. "He'll think about it. He may or may not behave himself about it, but he knows I spend more per month at that store than most of his other customers combined." Margaret set down the coat. "You shouldn't have to spend political capital protecting a woman you've known for 3 days." "No," Caleb said simply. "But here we are." She looked at him. "It won't be just Hensley." "I know. There'll be more. There are always more. Once someone starts—" "I know," he said again. "Margaret." He said her name for the first time, and it stopped her. "I've been in this territory for 22 years. I've been managing other people's opinions of my choices for about that long. The ones that came out here before I did built something and then lost it. And the ones that came after me built something, and some of them lost it, and some of them didn't. The difference wasn't usually about whether their neighbors approved of them." He uncrossed his arms. "Hensley will do what he decides to do. So will the rest of them. That's not something I can change by sending you back to that station." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your daughter. What about her? Will this affect how people treat her at school?" He paused. That one landed differently than the others. She could see it in the way his face changed. "It might," he said. "That matters more than the rest of it," she said. "Yes. So I want you to tell me honestly if it starts affecting Clara. Not the feed store, not what Hensley or Edna Marsh or anyone else thinks about your judgment. If it starts affecting Clara, I need to know." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "I will." She picked up the coat and the needle. "Good. Now go check your cattle. You're 40 minutes late." He went. Duff, who had been in the back of the barn the entire time and had said absolutely nothing, came around the corner of the last stall and took down a bridle from the wall hook and said, without looking at her, "He hasn't talked that much in one stretch since I don't know when." "He talks when there's something to say," Margaret said. "That's more than most," Duff said, and went to saddle his horse. The next 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that Margaret recognized as the rhythm of work that has found its proper channel. She was up before 5 every morning. She made breakfast and she kept the house, and she tackled the backlog of mending that had accumulated across the ranch like a form of geological deposit. Things layered and compressed over time until they'd become a feature of the landscape rather than a problem to be solved. She found, in a chest in the hall, a quantity of fabric that had once been meant for curtains or household linens, and she used what was appropriate and set aside what wasn't, and made a list of what the ranch legitimately needed in terms of repair. She found also, in the same chest, wrapped in brown paper, a woman's half-finished quilt. She recognized what it was immediately. The pattern was one she knew, a particular star design, complex, the kind that took planning. It had been in progress and then stopped, suddenly, partway through a block. The needle still threaded, the thread end left loose, as if whoever had been working on it had only stepped away for a moment. She wrapped it back up carefully and returned it to the bottom of the chest and didn't mention it to anyone. Clara discovered her ability to do sewing about a week in when Margaret was letting out the hem of a skirt Clara had outgrown in the wrong direction. Longer in the body, not wider, so that the hem was now 2 inches too short. Clara watched with the intense focus she brought to things that interested her, which was most things. "Can you teach me that?" she asked. "Which part?" "The part where you do it so it doesn't look terrible." "That's the whole part. It takes a while." Margaret snipped a thread. "You have to be willing to do it badly for a long time first." "How long?" "Depends on the person. Months? Maybe longer before it looks like anything." Clara considered this with appropriate gravity. "Can we start now?" "After your schoolwork." "I already did it." "Show me." Clara went and got her schoolbook, and Margaret went through it and found a subtraction problem with an error in it and pointed at it without comment. Clara looked at it and said, "Oh," and took the book back and fixed it. Margaret looked at the corrected version and said, "Now we can start." She gave Clara a needle and a scrap of fabric and showed her the basic running stitch. Clara's first attempts were uneven and pulled too tight, and she stabbed her finger twice. She did not complain about any of this. She only looked at her uneven stitches and then at Margaret's even ones and said, "Mine look terrible." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "You could have said they look fine." "They don't look fine. They look like someone's first stitches. Those are different things." Clara looked at her with the gray eyes. "Most people say they look fine." "Most people aren't teaching you to sew," Margaret said. "Try again, slower this time." Clara tried again. They sat at the table by the stove while outside the wind pushed against the walls of the house and the cold settled in for another night. And the lesson went on until Clara's finger was too sore to grip the needle, and Margaret told her that was enough for today. Clara put down the needle and the fabric. Her stitches by the end were still uneven, but slightly less so, and she sat for a moment looking at her work. "Mrs. Ellis," she said. "Margaret." Clara looked up. The offer of the first name seemed to require adjustment, like furniture moved to a new position. "Margaret," she said, "did you have children?" The question came the way Clara's questions always came. Direct, without preamble, with a child's complete unawareness of the terrain it crossed. Margaret looked at the scrap of fabric in her hand. "No," she said. "We wanted them. It didn't happen." Clara absorbed this. "Do you regret it?" "Clara, that's—" Margaret started and then stopped. The child wasn't being cruel. She was genuinely asking. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "less than I used to." Clara nodded slowly as though she were filing this away next to other things she'd been collecting. "I think about what it would be like if my mother hadn't died," she said. "I don't remember her very well. I have to try hard to remember what she sounded like." She looked at her needle again. "Papa doesn't talk about her much. I think it hurts him too much. That's usually why people don't talk about things." "Does it get better, the hurting part?" Margaret was careful with this. She thought about Thomas, about the particular evolution of grief, how it changed shape rather than diminishing, how it became something you carried differently over time rather than something that got lighter. "It changes," she said. "It doesn't go away, but you get better at carrying it." Clara sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her needle again. "One more try," she said. Margaret looked at her, at this 10-year-old who made too much stew because she'd learned to compensate for loneliness with excess, who had been managing her own grief in the only ways available to her, who had watched her father move through his loss like a man walking through water for 4 years. She handed her a new piece of fabric. "One more try," she said. The trouble that she'd expected to come in ones and twos started arriving in a formation. She heard about it from Clara first, who came home from school one afternoon in the second week with a set expression that her father's face also wore when something had gotten under his skin. "Jenny Hensley said something at school," Clara said, dropping her bag. Caleb looked up from the table. "What did she say?" "That our house has a bad woman in it, and her mother said so." Clara said it with the flatness of someone reporting facts whose implications she has not yet decided what to do with. I told her that Jenny's mother buys overpriced ribbon at her aunt's store and calls it economy. Caleb blinked. Where did you learn to say something like that? I pay attention. Clara looked at Margaret. Did I do wrong? You defended yourself, Margaret said carefully. That's not wrong. The way you did it could have been better. She paused. But I've said worse. Clara seemed satisfied with this. She went to hang up her coat. Caleb looked at Margaret. Margaret looked back at him. It's starting, she said. I know. What do you want to do? He was quiet for a moment. His jaw was set in that way it got. The particular set that she'd started to recognize as him thinking something through before he said it. Nothing different than we've been doing, he said finally. Unless you think I should. She thought about it. She thought about what retreating would look like, her going back to the station, and what it would mean for Clara to watch that happen. This woman who had come into their house and taught her stitching and told her the truth about grief, and then left because the neighbors got noisy. No, she said, nothing different. He nodded once, slowly. The set of his jaw eased slightly. Good, he said. He pushed back his chair and went to check on the evening feed. Margaret looked at the coat on the rack by the door, the gray wool one. She'd been looking at it every day, this artifact of an absence that the whole house had organized itself around without knowing it. She reached out and straightened it on its hook. Just straightened it. She didn't move it. She just made sure it was hanging properly, which it hadn't been. Then she went to start supper. Outside, the temperature was dropping again. You could feel it in the walls. There was another storm coming. You could smell it in the air when you stepped out. That particular cold that was different from regular cold, heavier, and with more intention behind it. Neither Margaret nor Caleb knew yet what that storm would bring. Neither of them could have predicted what the next weeks held. What would break open and what would hold, who would show themselves for what they were, and what it would take to keep 3 people and a ranch intact through the hardest kind of winter. What Margaret knew, setting the pot on the stove that night, was simpler than all of that. She knew the house felt different than it had the night she'd arrived. She knew Clara's stitches were already, incrementally, getting better. She knew the breeding ledger was current for the first time in 2 years. She knew that when Caleb came in from the evening check, he would sit down and drink his coffee, and they would talk through the next day's work, the way people talk when they have stopped performing conversation and started actually having it. And she knew, finally, though she held it carefully, the way you hold something you're afraid of dropping, that she had not touched the latches on her suitcase since the second night. Not once. The pot began to heat. The smell of it moved through the house. Through the window above the basin, she could see the sky getting thick and dark in the north, the way it does when weather is building. She watched it for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove. The storm that Margaret had watched building in the northern sky 3 days earlier arrived without the courtesy of a warning. One morning, the temperature was cold in the ordinary way, unpleasant, manageable, the kind of cold you dressed for and worked through. By afternoon, it had become something else entirely. The wind shifted east and then north, and the sky went the particular greenish-gray that old-timers in Montana learn to respect the way sailors respect a certain color of water. By the time Caleb came in from the afternoon cattle check, snow was falling sideways and the visibility between the house and the barn had dropped to maybe 30 yards. "It's going to be a bad one," he said, pulling off his coat in the doorway. Snow fell from it onto the floor, and he left it there, which told Margaret something about how his mind was running. "I'm going to need duff on the south pasture fence line first thing tomorrow. If that section gives way in this wind—" "The section you said needed bracing last week," she said. He looked at her. "You mentioned it when we were going through the November entries in the ledger. You said the east post on the south line was soft, and you'd get to it before real winter." "I remember," he said. He said it without defensiveness, just acknowledgement, the way he took in information that was accurate whether or not he liked it. "I didn't get to it." He moved to the stove and put his hands near it. His fingers were white at the tips. "If we lose that fence in this wind, the herd will drift south, and we'll spend a week finding them in the breaks. Then go brace it now, before dark." Can't see well enough to work the post safely. Too much risk of Duff or I losing a hand to the tools in this wind. He turned from the stove. It'll have to be first light tomorrow before it gets worse. She accepted this with the part of her that had learned to accept the limits of what could be done. How long will the storm last? 2 days. Maybe 3. Could be less if the front moves through fast, but the way this one's sitting, he shook his head. 3 days minimum. She had extra food on. She'd started the big pot that morning with the instinct that came from a lifetime of watching weather change fast. There was bread that had been baked yesterday. There was enough flour for more. She'd started an inventory of the cold larder 2 weeks ago, and she knew what was in it the way she'd known what was in the shop inventory in Missouri. Not because she'd memorized numbers, but because she'd actually looked. Clara came in from school. The neighbor's wagon had barely made it, the man's face tight with the effort of pushing the horses through wind that was getting meaner by the hour. She stamped snow from her boots and unwound her scarf, and looked at her father and then at Margaret with the expression she'd developed for situations that required assessment before speaking. Bad? She asked. Manageable, Caleb said. That means bad, Clara told Margaret. Go do your schoolwork, Caleb said. Clara. She went. But she did her schoolwork at the table in the main room rather than in her bedroom, which meant she was keeping herself in the center of things. Margaret understood this completely. The first night of the storm was loud. The wind found every imperfection in the house's construction, gaps at window frames, the place where the chimney pipe met the roof, and spoke through them at volume. The stove worked hard. Margaret was up twice in the night to feed it, and the second time she was up, she stood in the main room in the dark, listening to the storm pressing against the walls, and she thought about the cattle in the south pasture, and the soft post on the fence line, and the particular helplessness of waiting for daylight to know what kind of damage you were dealing with. She thought also about the stranded travelers she'd noticed on the train platform 3 days ago. 2 families and a pair of young men who'd been waiting for the connecting line west. She didn't know if they'd found shelter. She didn't know where they were. She told herself this was not her concern, and it was true, and it didn't help much. She went back to bed and lay awake until 4, and then got up and started breakfast. Caleb and Duff were out before full light to check the fence line, Duff riding one of the ranch horses and Caleb on the gray, both of them layered with everything they owned that would hold off wind. Margaret watched them go from the window and then turned to Clara, who was standing behind her. They'll be back, Margaret said. I know, Clara said, but she stayed at the window until they disappeared into the white. They were back by mid-morning. The fence had held on the post, but 2 sections of wire in a different spot had given way under accumulated snow weight, and they'd spent 4 hours in the wind working wire pliers with cold hands, and Duff's right hand had a bad cut across 2 fingers from the wire that Margaret cleaned and wrapped when they came in, Duff's face gray-white with cold, and the particular expression of a man who is not going to complain about something regardless of how much it hurts. Can you work the hand? She asked him. I'll manage. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. Of all the adjustments Duff Alcott had made to her presence in the house, the hardest one had been the directness. He was a man who'd operated for years in a world of implication. Well enough, he said, for what needs doing. Then keep it warm. Don't let the fingers go stiff. She tied the last strip of cloth. If the sensation changes, tell me. Don't wait until morning. He nodded once and went to the stove to warm the hand. Caleb had watched this exchange from across the room. He didn't say anything, but when she moved past him on the way to the kitchen, he said quietly, Thank you. It's just wrapping, she said. No, it's not, he said, and then he went to get dry clothes. The second day of the storm was worse than the first. The wind dropped, but the snow intensified, falling heavy and steady and relentless, and by the afternoon of the second day, there was 3 feet of it on the level and drifts against the north wall of the barn that were well above Margaret's head. Caleb and Duff took turns at the barn every 4 hours, checking the animals, keeping the water from freezing solid, making sure the structure itself was holding. Between turns, they came inside and dried out and went again. Clara finished her schoolwork. She worked on her stitching, her 3rd piece of practice fabric, her stitches noticeably more even than the first 2. She helped Margaret with the bread, and she read from a book she'd been working through about the American West. The actual West, she told Margaret, not the made-up kind. And she asked approximately 400 questions across the day, which Margaret answered as they came, not breaking stride on whatever she was doing. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, Clara said, "There's a horse." Margaret looked up from the stove. Outside. Clara was at the window, nose nearly touching the glass. A horse without a rider. Margaret crossed to the window. She looked through the snow-streaked glass and saw, at the edge of the property near the road, a horse, dark brown, saddled, moving in a tight, anxious circle the way frightened horses do, head down and swinging, alone. Her stomach dropped. "Where's your father?" "He went to the barn 20 minutes ago." Clara was already moving toward the coat rack. "Stop." Margaret said it sharply enough that Clara stopped. "You stay here, you hear me? You stay in this house. But the horse, I'll get your father. You do not go outside." She held Clara's eyes until she saw the compliance there. Not happy compliance, but real compliance, the kind that meant the instruction had actually landed. "Promise me." "I promise," Clara said, "but please hurry." Margaret pulled on her coat and boots and pushed out into the storm. The cold was an assault, not the daytime cold they'd been operating in. This was something past that, the wind having found a second energy in the late afternoon, and the snow in her face was like needles. She bent her head and pushed for the barn, 30 yards that took longer than they should, because the drifts between the house and the barn were thigh-high in places, and she had to pick her way through them. She hit the barn door with her shoulder and pushed inside. Caleb was at the far end checking the water trough. He turned when she came in. "There's a loose horse on the road," she said, catching her breath. "Dark, saddled, no rider." She watched the change move through him, the assessment, the decision, faster than thought. "How long has it been there?" "I don't know. Clara saw it." He was already reaching for his coat, which he'd hung on the stall rail. "Stay here," he said. "Caleb." She said his name the way she'd heard Clara say it, the way it carried weight in this family. He stopped. "Where is Clara?" "In the house. She promised." Something in him eased, fractionally. "All right." He pulled his coat on. "There's a maintenance cabin about 1.5 miles north, along the old rail right-of-way. If that horse threw a rider in this weather, they could be out there in this," she finished. "Yes." "Then you need someone with you." "Margaret, you need someone with you," she said again. "A person down in this cold, 1.5 miles out. You cannot bring them back and manage a horse. That's too many things for one person." She was already pulling her scarf tighter. "I know what cold exposure looks like. I nursed it in Missouri. I know what to do when someone's been down too long." He looked at her. She could see him calculating the distance, the risk, the alternatives, the fact that Duff's hand was wrapped, and the man was already on the edge of what his body could do today. "You'll do everything I say," he said, "within reason." "No, everything." He said it flat. "Out there in that you follow my lead on where to walk and when to stop. That's not negotiable." "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He grabbed a length of rope from the wall. "Stay close." They went out into it. Margaret had told herself she knew winter. She'd lived through Missouri winters and the 2 Montana winters since she'd been in the territory, and she'd thought she understood what it meant to be cold. What she discovered in the first 50 yards north of the barn was that she had been wrong in the specific way that people are wrong about things they've never actually experienced at their outer limit. The wind out of shelter was a different force entirely. It had intention. It pushed against her chest and her face with a physicality that was almost offensive, as though the air itself were hostile, and the snow it carried was no longer falling so much as flying, horizontal and dense, and finding every edge of clothing. Caleb moved ahead of her at a pace that was measured and deliberate, not fast, picking the way with the knowledge of a man who had walked this ground 1,000 times and knew where it would betray you. He kept looking back. She kept moving. She focused on his back in the white and put one foot after the other. The horse was still there on the road, or near enough. It had moved 20 yards south but was still circling, and when Caleb came near it, he moved slowly, talking in the low, even voice that worked on animals the way it sometimes worked on people, and he got close enough to take the bridle and then stood with it for a moment, letting the animal settle. The tracks were already half filled in with snow, but there were tracks. She could see them leading north, the double line of hoofprints and something else, something heavier and irregular alongside them. Someone was walking with the horse, she said, raising her voice against the wind. Or being dragged. He wrapped the horse's reins around his hand. Come on. They followed the tracks north along the road. The wind was behind them now, which was better, but the going was hard and slow through the drifts. They didn't talk. There was no point in talking. The wind took the words before they could travel. Margaret counted her steps because it gave her mind something to hold on to besides the cold. Caleb stopped. Ahead, the outline of a building came visible through the snow. Low, rectangular, timber-built, the maintenance cabin he'd mentioned. The door was partly open, moving in the wind. He went first, pushing the door wide, and Margaret came in behind him and pulled it shut. The cabin was dark and smelled of old coal and damp wood, and the particular closed smell of a space that hasn't been opened in months. There was a small stove in one corner, cold, a table, 2 rough bunks against one wall, a stack of firewood, dry, against the opposite wall. On the floor, huddled in the corner near the stove, was a girl. Margaret's heart seized. Clara. But it wasn't Clara. The girl was slightly older, 12 or 13, she thought, and she was not from this ranch. She was wearing clothes that were soaked through, her coat clearly inadequate for what she'd been in, and her face was the particular bloodless color that meant she'd been cold for too long. Her eyes were open and she tracked them coming in, which was a good sign, but she was shaking so hard her teeth were knocking together audibly. Hey, Caleb said, going to one knee in front of her. Hey, can you hear me? Yes, the girl said. The word barely came out. Are you alone? No. She pointed toward the door, which meant toward the road. My father, he went for help. The horse, the horse got loose, and he said, stay here, but it's been... She stopped. The shaking took over. How long? Margaret asked. I don't know, a long time. Margaret was already moving to the firewood. She'd seen the tinderbox on the shelf above the stove on her way past it. She was calculating what she had to work with. Dry wood, a tinderbox, a stove, 2 bunks, the extra coat she'd grabbed when Caleb wasn't looking because some part of her had known. She hadn't known this specifically, but she'd known that you go out into a storm prepared for more than you expect. Start the fire, she said to Caleb. I'll take the horse and look for the father. Caleb looked up at her. You're not going back out alone. She can't ride. You can't leave her alone in here, and the fire isn't lit yet, and someone is out there. She said it directly, the way he'd taught her by example to say things in this house. I can handle a horse in snow. I'm going north on the road 2 minutes, and I come back. If I don't find him in 2 minutes, I come back and we go together. She paused. Start the fire. She could see him hating it. She could see every part of his judgment arguing against it, and she could also see him doing the same calculation she'd done and arriving at the same answer. 2 minutes, he said. If you're not back... I'll be back. She went back out. She found the man 70 yards north of the cabin. He had made it that far from the cabin going for the horse, or going for help, and then the cold and probably the wind had gotten into him, and he'd gone down in a drift on the west side of the road. She saw the dark shape of him, and it was wrong enough, too still, too low, that she pushed the horse forward fast. He was alive. Barely, but alive. When she got off the horse and crouched beside him and grabbed his shoulder and said loudly, Sir, can you hear me? He made a sound, not a word, a sound. We need to move, she said. She looked at him. He was not a small man. He was in fact considerably larger than she was, which was going to be a problem. I need you to help me. I need you to get up. I can't lift you, and I need you to help me. Nothing. Sir? She grabbed both his shoulders and shook him, which was not gentle, but was necessary. There is a warm room 30 seconds from here. Your daughter is in it. She is waiting for you. I need you to get up. He moved. Slowly, with the dull mechanical effort of a body that has already started to shut down, but he moved. She got one of his arms over her shoulders, and she was not strong enough for this. She knew she wasn't. She felt it in her back and her knees, the protest of a 58-year-old body being asked for more than it had available, But she did it anyway because there was no alternative, and because in her experience the body will do more than it believes possible when there is genuinely no other choice. She got him upright. She walked him to the horse. She could not get him onto the horse alone. That was clear immediately. But she could lean him against the animal's side and keep him there, and she led the horse those 70 yards back to the cabin with the man leaning against it, feet barely moving, her voice in his ear the whole way telling him to keep moving. You're almost there. 30 more feet, 20, 10. Because she'd learned from nursing Thomas that the voice is the last thing the body hears, and it matters more than people think. Caleb had the fire going. He came to the door when she reached it and took the man's other side without a word, and between them they got him through the door and onto one of the bunks. The girl made a sound that was not quite a cry. Something more fundamental than that. Something that came from the place where relief and terror live side by side. "Papa," she said. "He's here," Margaret said. "He's going to be all right. He's cold and he needs warming, but he's going to be all right." She started pulling off the man's outer coat, which was heavy with snow and ice. "What's your name?" "Alice," the girl said. "Alice, I need you to move away from that stove a little bit. Not away from the heat, just not directly against the metal. Too fast is bad." She glanced at the girl's hands. "Can you feel your fingers?" Alice looked at her fingers as though she'd only just remembered they existed. "Some of them." "Good. Wiggle them for me." They wiggled, imperfectly, but they moved. Caleb had more wood on the fire. The stove was beginning to put out real heat now, and the temperature in the small cabin was climbing. Margaret pulled the extra coat from under her own coat where she'd stuffed it and laid it over the man on the bunk. She pulled his boots off. His feet were cold, but not discolored the bad way. She worked his feet between her hands without being asked. "My name is Margaret," she said, because it seemed like the time for that. "The man who lit the fire is Caleb Whitmore. This is his ranch property you walked into." "Thank you," Alice said. Her voice was still shaking. "We didn't know. The train stopped outside of town and they said to wait, but it was getting cold in the cars, and Papa said there was a cabin on the map he had, and—" "How many people are in the train cars?" Caleb asked from across the room. He was completely still, but it was the focused stillness, the processing kind. "A lot," Alice said. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 20? They said we'd stay on the train, but the coal was running low, and—" Caleb looked at Margaret over the girl's head. She looked back at him, and she saw the thing move through his face. The same thing she'd been thinking since Alice said it. 20 people, on a stalled train, running low on coal, in the second night of a storm that was not done. "How far is the train from here, Sonny?" he asked Alice. "Papa said 2 miles, maybe a little more. North, on the road." Margaret's hands kept working the man's feet. "He needs to stay in this heat for at least an hour," she said to Caleb, because she knew where his mind was going. "You can't move him in this weather, not yet." "I know." He stood. "But I can go back to the ranch and get Duff and the horses, and we can get to that train." Duff's hand, he's had hurt hands before. He was already moving toward the door. "Stay with them. I'll be back with Duff in the wagon in 2 hours." "The wagon won't make it through these drifts. Horses will." He paused at the door. "Can you manage?" She looked at the man on the bunk, at Alice hunched near the stove. She looked at the fire that was building, the dry wood stacked, the stove she'd already assessed and understood. She had her coat and her medical knowledge and the stubbornness that had kept her standing on that platform when everything else had failed. "Go," she said. He went. And Margaret Ellis was left alone in a cabin in the middle of a Montana blizzard with a man she'd half carried 70 yards through the snow and a girl she'd never met. And the fire she was tending, and the knowledge that somewhere 2 miles north there were 20 more people who needed what she had. She set Alice to holding a piece of warm cloth, heated near but not on the stove, against her father's hands while she worked his feet more carefully, checking the color, the response, the sensation as it returned. The man, his name was George, Alice told her, George Talbot, a carpenter out of Chicago heading west for work, began to come back slowly, the shaking replacing the terrible stillness, which was progress even though it looked worse. "Am I going to be all right?" he managed, around 40 minutes in. "You'll be sore tomorrow," Margaret said. "Your hands and feet are going to hurt as they warm up. That's normal. It means the feeling is coming back. My daughter. She's fine. She's right here. Alice, from the other bunk where Margaret had finally made her sit down, said, I'm here, Papa. He closed his eyes. I told her to stay in the cabin, he said. I told her not to go out. She didn't, Margaret said. She waited. She did everything right. He was quiet for a moment. The horse threw me, he said. Coming up from the train, the horse, I'd borrowed it from someone at the train. One of the passengers had a horse in the stock car. It threw me, and I thought I'd got it calmed down, and then in the dark it went again, and he stopped. How did you find me? The tracks, she said. And the horse? He was quiet again. Then, you're not from that cabin. No. You came out in this to find me. Someone needed to. He looked at her. He had a broad face, an honest face, the kind that showed everything it was thinking with minimal filter. Ma'am, he said, I'm going to be thanking you for a long time. Wait until you can feel your feet before you make promises, she said. But it came out less brusque than she'd intended. She fed the fire. She kept the temperature steady. She talked to Alice in the intervals, quiet conversation, practical, the kind she'd learned in sick rooms that keeps the room from closing in, about the train, about Chicago, about what Alice's mother thought of the plan to move west, about Alice's two brothers who were still back east with an uncle. Alice talked the way young people talk when they've been frightened and the fear is receding and they need the sound of words to confirm that everything is still real. Margaret listened the way she'd always listened, with most of her attention on the information and some of it on the tone underneath. George Talbot was sitting up by the time they heard the horses. It wasn't Caleb alone. Caleb had gone to the ranch and gotten Duff's wrapped hand and all, and then the two of them had gone north to the train before coming back, and they brought back not 2 passengers but 8, the most vulnerable ones, the ones the conductor had identified as needing shelter before the coal gave out entirely. 2 older women who had been sharing one coat between them, a family with a child younger than Alice, 2 men whose inadequate clothing had made them the conductor's greatest concern. They came into the cabin in a mass of cold and noise and relief, and the cabin, which had felt barely large enough for 3, somehow absorbed them all. Margaret moved through them with the practiced efficiency of someone who has triaged before, checking hands, checking faces for the white patches of frostbite, directing people to the heat with the specific instruction not to put cold limbs directly against the stove, using the extra blankets that Caleb had strapped behind his saddle to layer people onto the bunks and the floor. Caleb watched her work from the door. She was aware of him watching, but didn't stop to acknowledge it because there were still hands to check, and a child who was crying from the pain of warming fingers, and a woman who needed to be talked down from a state that was close to panic. Duff went back out with Caleb to bring in the remaining passengers from the train in relays. It took 3 trips. It took most of the night. The cabin that had been built to shelter 2 or 3 railroad maintenance workers held, by the time the last group came in, 17 people and 2 ranch hands and a woman from Blackridge who'd been turned away from a platform 3 weeks ago. Among the last group Caleb brought in were 2 women Margaret recognized. She didn't say anything when she saw them. Edna Marsh's companions from the platform, both of them, bundled in furs that were now soaked and completely failing at their purpose, their faces stripped of every advantage of dress and position, reduced to the baseline of human beings who are cold and need warming. One of them looked at Margaret and recognized her. She saw it happen in the woman's face, the flash of it, the complicated thing that recognition is when it comes at a disadvantage. Margaret said nothing. She checked the woman's hands and directed her to a spot near the stove and moved on to the next person, not because she'd forgiven anything, not because she'd forgotten the platform and the whispers and the feeling of that bench under her in the cold, but because there were too many people who needed help for her to spend time on what she felt about any of them. George Talbot, sitting up fully now on his bunk with a cup of something hot that Duff had produced from a saddlebag, watched her move through the crowded cabin. "Who is she?" he asked Caleb, who had come in to warm his hands between trips. Caleb looked at Margaret. She was crouching beside the child now, the one whose fingers had hurt, talking to it in the low way that worked. "She's Margaret Ellis," he said. "She lives at my ranch." "She lives there?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. She does. Outside, the storm pushed against the walls of the cabin with everything it had. The fire held, the heat held. The people in the cabin, strangers and near strangers, and a woman, two of them had publicly turned away, held, packed in against each other by necessity, which is sometimes the only way people allow themselves to close the distance. Margaret kept the fire fed through the night. When people fell asleep, she adjusted their coverings. When someone woke from cold or anxiety, she was there. She did not sleep. There was too much to do, and she had, in her life, gotten good at going without sleep when going without was what the situation required. Somewhere near 3 a.m, in a brief quiet interval when most of the cabin was asleep and the storm had dropped a degree or two in intensity, Caleb came and stood beside her at the stove. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there, warming his hands, and she stood beside him doing the same. "The man you carried in," he said quietly. "George Talbot." "Yes." "He told me what you did, getting him up from the drift." "It wasn't graceful." "He said you talked the whole way, told him his daughter was waiting, told him to keep moving." She said nothing. "That's the thing that got him up," Caleb said. "He told me." The voice. "He said he almost didn't get up, and then he heard you say his daughter was waiting, and that's the thing that got him moving." He was quiet for a moment. "That matters, knowing what to say." "I knew because someone said it to me once," Margaret said. "When Thomas was very sick and I was running low the way George Talbot was running low. Someone told me that he needed me, and that was the thing that got me up." Caleb turned and looked at her. She met his eyes, and then looked back at the fire. "You learn what works," she said, "and then you use it." He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. One of the sleeping passengers shifted and settled again. "The woman near the window," he said, "the one in the wet fur coat." "I know who she is," Margaret said. "She looked at you when she came in." "I know." "You helped her anyway." "She had cold hands," Margaret said. "Cold hands are cold hands regardless of who they belong to." Caleb was quiet again. Then he said very quietly, so only she could hear it, "I'm glad I stopped at that station." Margaret looked at the fire. She thought about the bench. She thought about the suitcase beside the bed at the ranch, closed for 3 weeks now, the latches untouched. "So am I," she said. And they stood there together in the warmth they'd made, while outside the storm did its worst, which turned out to not be enough. The storm broke on the 3rd morning. It didn't end dramatically. No sudden clearing, no sunlight cutting through in a single moment. It just stopped, the way exhaustion stops a person, gradually and then completely, the wind dying off by degrees through the early hours until by dawn there was only stillness and the enormous silence that follows heavy snow. The kind of silence that has weight to it. Margaret knew it had broken before she saw it. She felt it in the cabin walls, the absence of pressure, the change in how the stove drew air. She was awake already. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours in the entire 3 days. She stood at the cabin door and pushed it open and looked out. The world was white in every direction, white and still and brutally cold, but clear. The sky to the east had gone the pale gray-pink of early winter dawn, and the snow on the ground caught it and threw it back, so that the light seemed to come from everywhere at once. The road north toward where the train sat stalled was visible now, marked by the broken trail Caleb and Duff had made across the night's relays, churned and deep but passable. She stood there breathing the clean air for a moment. Then she went back inside to start the process of moving 17 people back to the train and then into town. It took the better part of the morning. Caleb and Duff made 2 more trips with horses. George Talbot could walk, slowly, with his daughter beside him, and Margaret's instructions in his ear about keeping his hands from the cold as much as possible and getting to a proper doctor as soon as they reached Black Ridge. The 2 women in the inadequate fur coats went in the first group. Margaret helped them into their coats without ceremony and pointed them toward where Duff was waiting with the horses and said, "Stay with the group." And they did, without once meeting her eyes. The family with the small child went with Caleb. The child had recovered completely, the resilience of young bodies being what it is,
She was talking steadily and trying to touch everything within reach by the time they left, and her parents looked like people who had aged 10 years overnight and were profoundly grateful for it. By 11 in the morning, the cabin was empty except for Margaret and the cold residue of everything that had happened in it. The flattened bedding on the bunks, the coffee-stained cups, the firewood reduced to a modest stack that she replenished from the outside pile before leaving because that was what you did with a cabin that had served you. You left it better than you found it. She banked the stove carefully so it would hold some heat but not burn without supervision. She straightened the blankets. She picked up what was clearly someone's lost glove from under one of the bunks and set it on the table where it could be seen. Then she walked out and closed the door. Caleb came back for her with the gray horse. He didn't say anything about the state of the cabin, but he looked at it when he arrived, and then at her, and she could see him noting it, the way he noted things. Quietly, without comment, filing it away. "Everyone's at the station," he said. "The railroad company sent a crew out from Helena on a work train when the storm broke. They're clearing the line." He paused. "Should have the passengers moving again by afternoon." George Talbot. "At the station? I asked the station master to find him a fire." He held out his hand to help her up behind him on the horse. "His hands are going to be fine, the doctor thinks." She took his hand and got up. She was tired in a way that had gone past the ordinary feeling of tired into something more structural, a weariness in her bones and her back and behind her eyes. But the kind of tired that comes after something finished, not the kind that accumulates without resolution. They rode back south toward Black Ridge. The snow on the road was deep and the horse moved carefully, and they were close enough that she could feel his coat against her shoulder and the steady warmth of another person after a long, cold night, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Clara," Margaret said eventually. "She's fine. Mrs. Peterson from the neighboring farm came over yesterday afternoon when we didn't come back. She stayed the night with Clara." He paused. "Clara was not happy about needing a sitter." "No," Margaret said. "I imagine not." She kept the stove going herself and made bread. Real bread, not what she usually makes. He said it with something in his voice that wasn't quite pride, but was in the neighborhood of it. "Mrs. Peterson said she bossed her around the whole evening about the proper way to do it." "She's been paying attention," Margaret said, apparently. The horse picked its way through a deep drift, and Margaret held Caleb's coat and didn't think too hard about any of it. Black Ridge came into view ahead of them, the buildings small and dark against all the white, smoke rising from chimneys, the water tower with its crooked crack, the station at the end of the road. Even from a distance, she could see there were more people out than usual. The storm's end bringing everyone outside to assess, to talk, to do the thing that small communities do after shared difficulty, which is to collect and account for one another. She could also see as they got closer that some of those people were looking in their direction. They stopped at the hitching post near the station. Margaret climbed down from the horse, less gracefully than she'd have liked. Her legs had stiffened in the cold, and Caleb got down and tied the reins. He put his hand briefly under her elbow as she found her footing and then took it away, the gesture so brief it was almost not there. The station platform had people on it, passengers from the stranded train, some of them. She recognized faces. The two women from the fur coats were there, standing near the station doors, talking to a woman Margaret didn't recognize in a manner that suggested they were recounting something. There was George Talbot, his hands wrapped, sitting on a bench with Alice beside him, and when he saw Margaret come up onto the platform, he stood immediately. "Mrs. Ellis," he said. "Mr. Talbot, sit down, please. Your feet need rest." "I'll sit when I've said what I need to say." He looked at her steadily. He was a broad, square-faced man, and she could see in his face exactly what he intended, and she braced herself slightly for the shape of it, the gratitude, which she had never learned to receive well. "You saved my life out there, you and Mr. Whitmore." He looked at Caleb too, then back to Margaret. "I've been alive 51 years, and I've had cause to thank people, and I've not always done it properly. I'm going to do it properly now." He held out his bandaged hand. "Thank you. That's insufficient and I know it, but it's what I have." She shook his hand carefully, mindful of the bandaging. "You got yourself up," she said. "I just reminded you why." "That's what getting someone up is," he said. "That's the whole of it right there." He released her hand. "If you ever find yourself in Chicago, you have a roof and a meal at my table. I mean that." "I'll remember," she said.
and she found, to her mild surprise, that she meant it. She became aware of the crowd around her gradually, the way you become aware of a sound that's been there for a while before you noticed it. The platform had been filling while she and Talbot spoke. Not just the train passengers, but townspeople, people she recognized from the weeks of sidelong looks and whispers. The woman from the dry goods store, who'd moved her children away on the day Margaret arrived. The man from the hardware store who'd watched Edna Marsh's performance on the platform with an expression of approval. They were all looking at her, not the way they'd looked at her on the day she arrived. Something had changed in the looking. She didn't trust it yet. She'd been through enough reversals to know that a crowd that turns toward you can turn away again just as fast. But she felt it, the shift, the reorientation, something that was working itself out in public in the way that only public things can. The station master, a thin man named Greaves, who had averted his eyes consistently for 3 weeks whenever Margaret came into town, walked over from the station doors. He stopped in front of her. He looked at his own hands for a moment, which she recognized as the gesture of a man deciding something. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, I want to say that I didn't handle your arrival well. What happened on this platform when you got here?" He looked up. "I could have intervened, and I didn't." Margaret looked at him. She thought about what he was asking for, underneath the words. She thought about whether she had it to give. "You didn't cause it," she said finally. "No," he said, "but I watched it happen and said nothing, and that's its own thing." He put his hands in his coat pockets. "I'm sorry for it." She nodded once. He nodded back and moved away, and she understood that this was the version of an apology available to a man like Greaves. Not effusive, not performative, just honest and short and real. Caleb, standing 2 feet behind her, said nothing. She was grateful for that. What she was less prepared for was Edna Marsh. She saw her before Edna Marsh saw her. The woman coming out of the station doors with the expression of someone navigating a situation she had not fully accounted for. Edna Marsh had clearly heard the account from her companions. She had clearly been working out her position through the morning. She had clearly arrived at something, and Margaret stood still and waited to see what it was. Edna Marsh walked across the platform and stopped 4 feet from Margaret, which was close enough for conversation and far enough to feel deliberate. "Mrs. Ellis," she said. "Mrs. Marsh." The woman looked, if she were honest about it, like someone who had not slept and had spent the sleepless hours in something unpleasant. Her face was arranged in a way that was trying for dignity and landing somewhere just short of it. "I've been told what happened at the cabin last night, and before that in the storm. It was a difficult night for everyone," Margaret said. "My companions—" Edna Marsh stopped, started again. "The people I was traveling with told me how you managed things, kept everyone warm, kept everyone together." She paused. "They said you helped them without—" Another pause. "Without saying anything about who they were or how they'd behaved." "Cold is cold," Margaret said. "What people did on a train platform 3 weeks ago doesn't change what they need in a snowstorm." Edna Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Margaret watched the calculation move through the woman's face. The pride, the stubbornness, the thing underneath those that was something more complicated. She had the sense of someone who had built her position in this town out of the management of reputation, other people's and her own, and was now confronting the cost of that management in a way she hadn't chosen and couldn't fully control. "I made a judgment based on a letter," Edna Marsh said. "That was wrong. I said it in public, and that was worse." She said it quickly, the way people say things that cost them, getting through it as fast as possible. "I'm not asking you to forget it." "I won't forget it," Margaret said. She said it without heat, just as a fact, the way Caleb stated facts. "But I don't carry it the way I used to carry things like that. I don't have the energy for it anymore." Edna Marsh absorbed this. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, and they both knew it. But it was something. A door left open a crack rather than bolted from the inside. "If you need anything in town," Edna Marsh said, "my establishment has supplies. I'd see to it you were fairly served." Margaret nodded. "Thank you." Edna Marsh walked away. Her back was straight and her pace was measured, and Margaret thought, she will go home and she will be privately miserable for about 2 days, and then she will adjust, because people like Edna Marsh always adjust. What they cannot survive is irrelevance, And the version of events that was being told on this platform this morning made Margaret Ellis relevant in a way that Edna Marsh's original narrative had not accounted for. She felt Caleb come to stand beside her. She could tell it was him without looking from the particular way he moved, the weight of his footsteps, the stillness he brought with him. "You all right?" he asked. "Tired," she said. "But yes." "We should get back to the ranch." He said it carefully. Not a command, a suggestion that was also an offer. She looked around the platform one more time. The passengers from the train were beginning to sort themselves. The work crew from Helena had cleared enough of the line, apparently, that the train would be moving within the hour. There were people boarding, people collecting their bags, people saying the things that get said when strangers who've been through something together are about to scatter and never see each other again. George Talbot caught her eye across the platform and raised his bandaged hand. Alice, beside him, waved with the natural ease of a young person who hasn't yet learned to restrain such things. Margaret raised her own hand. Then she turned away from the platform and followed Caleb to the horses. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, and the quiet was comfortable. Clara met them in the yard before they'd even gotten the horses to the barn. She must have been watching from the window. Running through the churned snow in her boots with her coat half on, and her face doing the thing it did when she was trying not to show how worried she'd been. She stopped 3 feet from Margaret and looked at her. "You were gone the whole night," she said. "I know." Mrs. Peterson said not to worry, but she kept looking out the window, too. "I'm sorry you were worried," Margaret said. "There were people who needed help, and we couldn't leave until we were sure they were going to be all right." Clara looked at her father, who had dismounted and was leading the gray toward the barn. "Papa too?" "Papa too." Clara looked back at Margaret. She was doing the assessment, the same one she did every time she walked into a room, tallying what she saw against what she expected. Margaret was tired and cold, and she had snow in her boots, and her hair was a disaster, and she was standing in the yard and the suitcase was inside the house, and she was not thinking about the suitcase at all. "Come inside," Clara said. "I made bread. I made too much because I was anxious, but it's real bread this time." She turned and walked toward the house. Then she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "You should probably come in soon because you look cold and you're not 20. "I'm aware," Margaret said. "I'm just saying." "Clara." "Yes?" "It's good bread," Margaret said. "I know it is, even before I've tasted it." She paused. "I know it because you paid attention." Clara looked at her for a moment in that particular way, the long, assessing look. And then she turned and went inside and left the door open. The days that followed were a different kind of day. Not better in a dramatic sense, not suddenly resolved into ease. The ranch still had all the work it had always had. The cattle still needed checking twice daily. Duff's hand was healing but not healed, and the practical demands of winter in Montana did not adjust themselves for what had happened in a storm or on a platform. But the town had shifted in the way that small communities shift after a shared event. Not uniformly, not all at once, but perceptibly. Like a herd that's changed direction without any individual animal making a dramatic turn. Tom Hensley at the feed store was correct in his pricing. He offered no commentary about Caleb's choices when they came in on Friday. He loaded the supplies himself, which he hadn't done before, and said as he was finishing, "Heard you were out in that storm helping the train passengers," in the direction of approximately the middle distance, not quite looking at either of them. "Margaret was," Caleb said. Hensley looked at Margaret then, just for a moment. "Good of you," he said. And then he went back inside. It was not a grand gesture. It was barely a gesture at all. But Margaret had learned over the years that the small things are often the accurate ones. The large gestures are easy to perform. The small adjustments are where people reveal what they actually think. The woman from the dry goods store stopped her on the main street 2 days later and asked, somewhat obliquely, whether Margaret knew anything about a particular type of darning stitch she was having trouble with. Margaret told her. The woman thanked her and left. The following week she stopped her again, a different question, and Margaret answered that one too, and by the third time it happened, it had become, without either of them naming it, a regular arrangement. Claire came home from school one afternoon and reported, without particular drama, that Jenny Hensley had not said anything further about the bad woman at the Whitmore Ranch. "I think her father told her to stop," Clara said, with the pragmatic assessment of a child who has understood that adult opinion shapes children's behavior. Either that or she got bored of it. Both are possible, Margaret said. Which do you think? I think the reason doesn't matter much. The result is the same. Clara considered this. That's a bit unsatisfying. Yes, Margaret said. It is. What Margaret noticed most in the weeks after the storm was not the town's adjustment, but Caleb's. It was a gradual thing, barely visible if you didn't know what you were looking at, but she had spent a month learning what he looked like at his baseline, and she could see the changes in it. He talked more at supper. Not a great deal more. He was not a man who talked for the sake of filling space, and she didn't want him to become one. But the silences at the table, which had been the weighted kind, the kind that pressed down, became ordinary silences, the kind that come between people who are comfortable enough not to need words. He started asking her things. Not about the ranch work, which he'd been doing since the first week, but other things. What she thought about the South pasture grazing situation in spring, whether she knew anything about the particular type of cough one of the younger cattle had been developing, what she'd thought of a book she'd taken from the shelf one evening and read by the stove, a book on frontier land management that had been his wife's, he said, though his wife had never been interested in the subject, so he didn't know why she'd bought it. She said, "Maybe she bought it for you and never said so." He was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe," he said. "I hadn't thought of that." She found the gray wool coat off the rack one morning. She found it on the back of a chair near the window, like it had been moved in the night by someone who wasn't sure where else to put it. She didn't move it again. She let it be wherever it ended up, and she didn't mention it, and neither did Caleb, and the rack by the door had an extra hook now, which she used for her own coat. The suitcase was still beside her bed. She had not opened it in over 3 weeks. She had not thought about Thursday trains or the cost of a room in town or the $12.40 that had seemed so significant on the platform in December. She thought about these things' absence the way you notice the absence of a pain you've been carrying so long you forgot it was there. She was mending a harness in the barn one afternoon, the leather repair she'd been putting off because harness leather required a different needle and a different thread than cloth, and she'd been waiting to get to the hardware store for the proper materials. When Duff came in from the far stall and leaned on the post and said, without preamble, "You planning on leaving?" Margaret looked up. "Why do you ask?" "Just asking." He was looking at the middle distance in the way he looked at things when he was actually looking at something specific. Weather's going to break in another month or 6 weeks. Road'll be easier. Train runs regular again from late February. He paused. "I'm just asking." She looked at the harness in her hands. She thought about what the question was really asking, which was not a simple question, and Duff knew it. "I don't have anywhere else to be," she said. "That's not the same as staying." "No," she said. "It's not." He waited. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I'm not going to make a claim I don't know is true." Duff nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. He straightened off the post. "That harness needs wax after you sew it, or the thread'll rot in a month." "I know," she said. "I was going to ask you where you keep the wax." "Back shelf, right side." He pointed without looking and went about his work. The question stayed with her through the afternoon. She knew what Duff was really asking. He was asking for a version of what Clara had asked in the first days, how long is a while, and he was asking it now because the answer mattered more than it had in the beginning, because the house had rearranged itself around her in ways that would require rearranging again if she left, and Duff had been watching that happen. She finished the harness and applied the wax and hung it on its hook. She walked back to the house in the late afternoon cold. Clara was at the table with her stitching. She'd moved on now from practice scraps to an actual handkerchief, simple, hemmed, her stitches still imperfect but consistent in their imperfection, which was its own kind of progress. She held it up when Margaret came in. "Better?" she asked. Margaret took it and examined it. "The corner's a bit loose. Here," she pointed. "The tension dropped when you turned. See where the spacing changes?" Clara looked. "Oh," she took it back. "I'll redo that part." "You don't need to redo the whole thing, just the corner." "I know," Clara said, with the tone of someone who actually does know. She smoothed the handkerchief on the table. "Margaret."
If you were going to leave, Clara said, without looking up from the handkerchief, would you say so before you just left?
Margaret sat down across from her. She looked at the top of Clara's head, the part that ran slightly crooked because Clara never let anyone else braid her hair, and she couldn't quite see the back of it herself. Yes, she said, I would say so. Because some people just leave, Clara said, without saying. I know, Margaret said. I would tell you. Clara smoothed the handkerchief again. She picked up her needle and began working at the loose corner with the careful focus she brought to things that required her best effort. She didn't say anything else, but the tension in her small shoulders dropped by degrees, and Margaret sat across from her in the warmth of the ranch house, and that was answer enough. That evening, Caleb came in late from the barn. A problem with one of the horses, a small stone bruise that required attention and had taken longer than he'd expected. He came in and washed his hands and sat down to the food that Margaret had kept warm, and he ate without ceremony, and they talked about the horse and whether the bruising was serious and what it meant for the spring work schedule. After Clara went to bed, Caleb sat at the table with his coffee and the open ledger that Margaret had been keeping current. It was a habit now, the evening review, both of them going through the day's entries and the next day's plan. He was looking at the February pages, which were still empty. She had left them empty because February was 6 weeks away and she hadn't known how to fill them. She was washing the supper dishes. She heard him turn the pages. She heard him stop. The February pages are blank, he said. I know. You usually fill them in ahead. She kept washing. I know. The silence had the texture of something being considered, not the heavy silence, not the performing kind, the kind where someone is working out how to say a thing they've decided to say. The room, Caleb said. I told you when you came that it wasn't temporary. You did. I want to be clear about what I meant by that. He paused. I meant that it's yours. The room. The place at the table. He stopped and she could hear him adjusting, finding the right edge of what he could say and what was too much. All of it. The ranch. The way it is now. This is your home if you want it to be. Margaret stood at the wash basin with her hands in the water, which had gone tepid. She thought about the bench, the suitcase, the $12.40, and the weight of other people's stories attached to her name like stones. She thought about Clara's stitches and Duff's taciturn approval and George Talbot's bandaged hand raised in farewell. She thought about a gray wool coat on a rack by the door and the extra hook that had appeared beside it. She thought about what home was, actually, whether it was a specific place or a specific arrangement of things, or whether it was something more like what she'd felt in the cabin in the storm, keeping the fire for people who needed it, and afterwards standing beside someone in the warmth you'd made together and feeling, for the first time in years, that she was exactly where her particular set of skills and her particular stubborn self was supposed to be. She dried her hands. She turned around. Caleb was looking at her across the room. He had the ledger open in front of him and his coffee at his elbow, and the lamp throwing his shadow long on the wall behind him. He was not performing anything. He was just looking at her with his gray-blue eyes that missed very little and saying what he'd decided to say and waiting for her answer. All right, she said. He looked at her for a moment. All right, yes, or all right, you'll think about it. All right, yes, she said. He nodded once. He looked back at the ledger. He turned to the February pages. The breeding rotation for the second week of February, he said. We should go over that tomorrow. I've been putting it off. After breakfast, she said. After breakfast, he agreed. She went back to the dishes. The water had gone cold and she poured it and refilled from the kettle, and the new water steamed in the basin, and she stood in the warmth of it, and the warmth of the stove, and the warmth of the house around her that was not, any longer, a temporary shelter. She stood there and she thought, this is what it feels like. Not the thunderclap version, not the sudden revelation. This. Dishes in warm water and a man at a table filling in the pages for a month that was still 6 weeks away, because that was what you did when someone was staying. You filled in the pages for February. She did not let herself make too much of it. She was 58 years old, and she had survived enough reversals to know that the feeling of solidity could prove unreliable. But she also knew The way she knew about cold hands and weather coming, and when a stitch was right and when it only looked right, that some things are true even when you're afraid to trust them. She finished the dishes. She went to sit by the stove, in the chair she'd come to think of as hers, and she picked up the mending that was always waiting, and she worked at it in the lamplight while Caleb worked at the ledger and the house settled around them both in the cold Montana night, solid and imperfect and very, very real. And in the hallway, in her room, the suitcase sat beside the bed with its brass latches closed and a thin layer of dust beginning to settle on its surface, which was the best thing she had seen in a long time. February came in cold and stayed that way for the first 2 weeks, which suited the ranch work well enough. Cold meant the ground stayed firm, which meant the cattle could move without bogging in the thaw mud that would come later and make everything harder. Caleb filled in the breeding rotation pages he'd mentioned, and Margaret filled in the household accounts alongside them, and the ledger that had been 2 years behind when she arrived was now current to the day. She'd stopped noticing the suitcase. That was the truest measure of the change. Not that she'd made a decision or said the right words, but that she walked past it every morning and every evening and her eyes went to other things. The hook with her coat. The shelf where she'd arranged her few books beside the ledger. The washstand with its mirror where she'd finally set out her hairpins and her tin of hand salve instead of keeping them packed. Small things. But the small things were the accurate ones. She'd learned that. The breeding rotation for the second week of February brought a complication that nobody had anticipated. One of the main bulls, Caleb called him Brick, for reasons that had apparently made sense to him at some point, had developed a lameness in his left foreleg that was significant enough to take him off the rotation entirely. This was not a minor problem. The spring calf numbers depended on the February and March breeding activity, and the secondary bull was younger and unproven, and Caleb had been reserving him for the following year. She found Caleb in the barn with Duff at 6 in the morning, the two of them crouched over Brick's foreleg in the lamplight, with the expressions of men looking at a problem they don't have a clean solution to. "How bad?" she asked from the doorway. "Bad enough," Caleb said. He straightened. "He's not going to be useful for 6 weeks at minimum, maybe 2 months. So you use the younger bull. He's not ready." "Is he capable?" Caleb looked at her. "Capable isn't the same as ready." "It is in February," she said. "You don't have the option of waiting for ready." She came into the barn and looked at Brick herself. The way he was holding the leg, the swelling above the fetlock, the particular quality of his misery, which was bovine and profound. "What caused it?" "Stepped in a drift wrong 2 days ago," Duff said. "I should have caught it sooner." "You caught it now," she said. She straightened up. "Caleb, the young bull, what's his name?" "I haven't named him." "What do you call him?" "The young bull." She looked at him. "I didn't want to name him until I knew whether he'd work out," Caleb said, with the particular defensiveness of a man who knows how something sounds. "He'll work out better if someone has expectations of him," she said. "Name him tonight." She turned back toward the house. "And I'll look at that leg again this afternoon. There are things you can do for inflammation if you catch it early enough." She heard Duff say, behind her as she left, in the low voice he used when he thought she couldn't hear, "She's not wrong about the expectations." And she heard Caleb say, "She's usually not." She kept that to herself and went to start breakfast. The young bull, whom Caleb named with characteristic practicality, February, which was either ironic or literal and probably both, performed adequately in his unplanned promotion. Not with the authority of an experienced animal, not without incident, but well enough that the spring numbers would hold. Margaret recorded this rotation in the ledger each day with the same methodical care she'd brought to every other record, and Caleb checked her entries each evening without once suggesting she'd gotten anything wrong, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Brick's leg, treated twice daily with the poultice she made from what she had available and what she sent Caleb to buy at the pharmacy in town, improved at a pace that was slow but consistent. By late February, he was bearing weight on it. By mid-March, she thought he'd be sound enough for light activity. Caleb watched this with an expression that started skeptical and moved by degrees toward something that was not quite wonder, but was in its vicinity. "Where did you learn that?" he asked one afternoon, watching her wrap the leg with the expertise of someone who has done it many times on many different bodies.
Doctoring isn't that different for cattle than for people, she said. The inflammation is the same. The principle is the same. You reduce the swelling, you keep the tissue moving, you don't let it stiffen. She tied the wrap. I learned it on people first, and then it turned out to apply elsewhere. You learned it from the doctor in Missouri. I learned it from Thomas first, she said. He was sick for a long time before he died. I had 2 years to figure out what worked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was getting better at the quiet that let her continue if she wanted to, and didn't push if she didn't. He was a good man, she said. Not a simple man. He had a temper when he was tired, and he was bad with money in ways I had to work around. And the situation with his brother, some of that was Thomas's doing, decisions he made that I didn't agree with. She secured the final wrap.
But he was good in the ways that count. He saw me. Not the version of me he wished I was or thought I should be. He saw the actual one. She stood. That's rarer than people think. Caleb looked at her. Yes, he said quietly. It is. She gathered her supplies. She didn't look at him directly, but she was aware of him in the way she'd become aware of him over these months. The particular gravity of his presence, the way the space in a room organized differently when he was in it. Caleb, she said. Nothing. She picked up the box of supplies. Just making sure you were listening, he said dryly from behind her. I generally am. March arrived and the snow began its serious retreat. Not all at once. Montana doesn't give ground easily in any season. But day by day the drifts receded, and the road that ran between the ranch and Black Ridge became passable without the constant negotiation of deep snow, and the world outside the ranch house windows went from white to a brown-gray-white patchwork that was almost more interesting to look at than the uniform winter had been. Clara's stitching had progressed. The handkerchief was finished and presentable, not perfect, still uneven in the places where her tension wavered, but real. A real-made thing. Clara had looked at it for a long moment when she finished it, and then looked at Margaret. It's not as good as yours, she said. No, Margaret agreed. It's as good as mine was at your age, which means you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Clara folded it carefully. Can I make something bigger next? What did you have in mind? A pillowcase. She said it matter-of-factly, as though this were a natural next step, which it was. For my room, the ones I have are old. We'll need more fabric. I know. Papa's going to town Thursday. I'll ask him to get some. She did ask him, and Caleb came back Thursday with the fabric, practical white cotton, more of it than she'd asked for, which Margaret suspected was Caleb's version of an endorsement. And the pillowcase project began that evening, while Margaret worked on the mending and the lamplight made the main room warmer than its actual temperature. It was in that same week, a Thursday evening, when Alice Talbot's letter arrived. Margaret hadn't expected to hear from them. George Talbot had said what he'd said on the platform, and she'd believed him in the moment, and then filed it under things that are said sincerely in extremity and then don't always translate to the ordinary world. She had not expected a letter. But there it was in the week's mail that Caleb brought back from town, a letter addressed to Mrs. Margaret Ellis, care of Whitmore Ranch, Black Ridge, in a young person's handwriting that was energetic and slightly too large for the page. She read it at the table while Caleb put away the supplies he'd brought back. Alice wrote the way she talked, directly, with minimal preamble. Her father's hands were fully healed. He was working with a construction firm in a town 50 miles west of Black Ridge, building houses for the spring land rush. He sent his regards and wanted Margaret to know the hand was good as new, or nearly. Alice herself was enrolled in the school there, which was larger than the one she'd come from in Chicago, and had a girl in it named Ruth who Alice thought she might get along with, though it was too soon to be sure. At the end, Alice had added a postscript. Papa says that the best thing that happened to us in Montana is that the horse threw him. I think that sounds strange, but I think I understand what he means. Margaret read the postscript twice. Then she folded the letter and set it on the shelf in her room, next to her books, where she kept things that deserved to be kept. It was in March, too, that the question of the old outbuilding came up. The building in question was at the east end of the ranch property, a structure that had been built as a secondary bunkhouse in the years when the ranch had run more hands and had been unused for over a decade. It was sound, structurally. Caleb had told her that when she'd first asked about it in January, curious about the property boundaries.
Good timber frame, good roof, floor needed work, but the bones were there. She brought it up at supper one evening without particular ceremony. "The East Building," she said. Caleb looked up from the ledger. Clara looked up from the pillowcase, which she'd brought to the table because she claimed the light was better there than by the stove. "What about it?" Caleb said. "I want to use it." She said it directly, which was the only way things got said in this house. There are women in Blackridge who don't have what they need: practical skills, medical knowledge, basic things. How to read a wound, how to manage a fever, how to do mending that actually holds, how to keep accounts when there's no one else to do it. She paused. "I've been talking to some of them over the past month. The woman at the dry goods store, one of the wives of the ranch hands east of town. There are more who don't say anything because nobody's made it easy to say." Caleb was watching her with the focused look. "You want to run a school?" "Not a school exactly, a workshop, a place to come and work and learn while working, practical, not formal."
She looked at him. "I want to do something with what I know before what I know is gone." The last part came out more plainly than she'd intended, but it was true and she wasn't going to dress it differently. Clara had stopped sewing. She was watching Margaret with the particular attention she gave to things she understood to be important. "The building needs the floor repaired," Caleb said. "I know." "And the window on the north side." "I know that too." He looked at the table for a moment. He had the expression of a man doing math that wasn't really math. "Duff and I can get to the floor in the next 3 weeks if the ground stays firm. The window's not complicated." He looked up. "What do you need inside it?" Margaret felt something move through her chest. Not surprise, exactly. She'd been learning to read this man for 3 months, and she'd known before she said it that he would not be the obstacle. But feeling it confirmed was still something. "A table or two, long ones, chairs, a stove. The building has a chimney already, somewhere to store materials." She paused. "I have a little money I can put to materials." "Keep your money," he said. "Materials come out of the ranch account." "Caleb, this is a ranch asset," he said, in the tone he used when something was decided. "Goodwill in town is a ranch asset. Happy women in the settlement is a ranch asset. And," he paused, the briefest pause, "it matters. What you're talking about matters. That's sufficient reason." Clara set down her pillowcase. "Can I come sometimes? After school?" "Yes," Margaret said. "You can help teach the stitching part." Clara looked startled. "I'm not good enough to teach." "You're good enough to teach beginners, which is what most of them will be." Margaret looked at her directly. "You know more than you think you know. That's also something I want you to practice, understanding about yourself." Absorb this with the seriousness she gave to things that required it. Then she picked up her pillowcase again and bent back over it, but her shoulders were different. She was sitting differently, with something additional in her posture that hadn't been there before. Duff repaired the floor in 2.5 weeks. He was meticulous about it, in the way he was meticulous about things that mattered to the ranch's function, and when it was done, Margaret walked across it, and it did not give or creak in any place it shouldn't. He fixed the north window in a single afternoon. He built the long tables himself, out of timber he had cut and stored, and he built them solid and plain and without asking what size they should be, because he'd watched her work long enough to know. He did not say anything about any of this. He built what was needed and went back to his regular work, and that was the whole of his commentary. She knew better by now than to expect him to add words to actions that were already clear. The workshop opened on a Wednesday morning in the second week of April. She hadn't made an announcement. She'd simply mentioned it in the conversation she'd been having, told the woman at the dry goods store, and asked her to tell whoever might be interested, and then she'd unlocked the East Building and put the stove on and set out the materials and waited. 4 women came. She had hoped for 4 and expected 2, so it was a reasonable beginning. The dry goods woman, whose name was Ruth Kavanaugh, a young wife who'd come to Montana with a husband who'd known more about optimism than about ranching, and who was managing the gap largely on her own competence. An older woman from the eastern edge of town who said almost nothing the first morning, but watched everything with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. And unexpectedly, Edna Marsh. Margaret had not known whether Edna Marsh would come. She'd told Ruth Kavanaugh to mention it to everyone, and she'd meant everyone, but she hadn't known if Edna would choose to come. There was something that needed resolving between them that had not quite resolved. The platform,
the letter from Phyllis Crane, the particular shape of a public humiliation that doesn't fully disappear even when the people involved have moved past the worst of it. Edna Marsh came in last, after the other three were already seated, and she sat at the end of the long table and folded her hands and looked at Margaret with an expression that was composed and careful, and also, underneath the composition, something that Margaret recognized as effort. The effort of being somewhere you're not sure you deserve to be. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "We're starting with wound management this morning, because it's the most immediately useful thing, and because everyone here has probably dealt with a wound poorly at some point and could do it better." She moved through the morning's instruction with the practical economy she'd developed over years of nursing, not lecturing, not performing, just working through the material the way you work through a task, step by step, with demonstration and repetition and the honest acknowledgement when something was harder than it looked. Edna Marsh, it turned out, had steady hands. Margaret noticed this when she had the women practice the basic wound wrap she'd shown them. Edna's wrap was tight and even on the first try, which took most people 3 attempts. "You've done this before," Margaret said. "I had a husband who was careless with tools," Edna said. It came out flat, not quite sad, the specific flatness of a fact that had been accommodated long ago. "Then you already know the principle," Margaret said. "You just need the vocabulary for it." Edna looked at her. Something shifted in her expression, the careful composure loosening, just at the edges. "I want to say something," she said, "if I can." The other 3 women went quiet in the particular way of people who know they're at the edge of something that isn't their business and are trying to occupy as little space as possible. "Go ahead," Margaret said. "What I did on that platform," Edna said. "I've been thinking about why I did it." She looked at her hands. "I've built things here over the years. My establishment, my place in this town. I've built them carefully, and I've protected them carefully. And when I build something carefully, I get..." She paused. "I get afraid of anything that might threaten it. And a woman who arrives with rumors attached to her name looks like a threat even when she's not one." She looked up. "That's not an excuse. It's an explanation. I know the difference." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Phyllis Crane is a specific kind of person," she said finally. "She takes a story that has a complicated shape and she flattens it until it fits the narrative she wants. The story she told about me had enough facts in it to sound true, and not enough context to be true." She picked up the roll of bandage cloth and set it down again. "My husband's brother wanted the estate, and Thomas had made choices before he died that complicated things. I fought for what was honestly ours, and I won, and Robert Ellis did not forgive me for winning. Phyllis Crane is Robert Ellis's wife's cousin. That's where the letter came from." Edna Marsh sat with this for a moment. "I didn't know any of that." "I know you didn't." "I should have asked before I put..." "Yes," Margaret said. "You should have." She said it without softening it, because it was true and Edna Marsh was not a woman who needed things softened. "But you're here now, and that counts for something." It was not a reconciliation with a bow on it. It was 2 women in a room who had gotten something wrong between them and were working out what remained on the other side of wrong. That was the most that real repair ever looked like, in Margaret's experience. Not resolution so much as resumption, the agreement to continue, to let the next day be a different day from the one before it. Ruth Kavanaugh, from the middle of the table, said quietly, "Can we do the wrap again? I think I held the tension wrong." And the morning moved on. By June, the workshop had 8 regular women coming twice a week. The range of what they worked on had expanded. Wound management and basic medicines had been joined by preserving and cold storage technique, account keeping for women whose husbands kept the books, but whose husbands were sometimes absent or sometimes gone in the ways that men in frontier country could be gone, and the sewing, which had become its own Thursday afternoon session that Clara taught with the gravity of someone older than 10 and the occasional impatience of someone who is exactly 10. Clara had developed, in her Thursday sessions, a teaching method that was entirely her own and that Margaret had not coached her on, a directness that did not comfort false progress, combined with an absolute patience for the mechanics of trying again. Women who were twice her age sat at the long table and worked their practice stitches, and Clara walked behind them and said things like,
That tension is too tight. You can see where the fabric's pulling. Try loosening your grip on the needle. With the authority of someone who has earned the right to correct by having been corrected herself and having understood why it mattered. Margaret watched this one Thursday from the doorway and felt something she couldn't quite name. Pride was part of it, but it was something wider than pride. The specific feeling of watching something you put in motion continue beyond what you directly caused. Like watching water find its own level after you've cleared the channel. Caleb came to pick Claire up at the end of the Thursday session, one afternoon in late June, and he stood outside the East Building for a few minutes listening through the open window before he came in. Margaret saw him, and he saw her see him, and he didn't look embarrassed about it. "She's good at that," he said quietly. "Yes," Margaret said. "She sounds—" He stopped, started again. "She sounds like she knows what she's doing." "She does know what she's doing." He was quiet for a moment. Her mother would have liked to see this. It was the first time he'd said anything like that directly to her. She felt the weight of it and knew he felt it too, and neither of them made it bigger than it was. "Tell her that sometime," Margaret said. "Not in a way that makes her responsible for it. Just tell her that her mother would have been pleased." He looked at her. "Is that the right thing to do?" "I think so," she said. "Children need to know they came from people who would have been proud of them. It helps them know what direction to keep growing." He was quiet for a long time after that. Summer brought its own work and its own rhythms, and the ranch found its footing in a way that it hadn't had in years. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but in the way that ground settles when what it's been missing is finally in place. The breeding season results came in better than Caleb had projected. February, the younger bull having proven himself beyond the minimum. Brick was sound again and back in rotation, and had apparently decided the younger bull's success was professionally offensive to him, which Duff said was probably good motivation. Margaret turned 59 in July. She had not told anyone the date was coming, but Clara had apparently found it somewhere. She did not say where, and Margaret had the sense that she'd asked Duff, who had asked Caleb, who had looked it up in some document or other that Margaret had signed at some point. And on the morning of her birthday, there was a cake on the table when she came out for breakfast. It was a lopsided cake. It leaned noticeably to one side, and the icing, which was a butter frosting of Claire's own invention, had been applied with enthusiasm rather than precision. There were 59 candles on it, which was too many for the size of the cake, and gave it the appearance of something agricultural rather than celebratory. Clara stood beside it with the expression of someone who has done a thing and is waiting to know if it was the right thing. "You made this," Margaret said. "I used the oven by myself," Clara said. "Don't tell Papa about the oven. He knows about the cake, but not about the oven part." "I know about the oven part," Caleb said from the doorway. Clara did not look surprised. "Are you upset?" "You're tall enough now," he said. He came in and looked at the cake. He looked at Margaret. "Happy birthday." She looked at the cake with its leaning profile and its excessive candles and the icing that was doing its imperfect best. She looked at Clara's face and Caleb's face and the kitchen of the house that was hers now, the shelf with her books, the hook with her coat, the mending basket in the corner with her own work in it. She had not cried in a very long time. She'd noticed that about herself years ago, the way grief and difficulty had taken her past the crying and out the other side into something harder and more enduring. She didn't cry now, but the feeling behind her eyes was the closest thing to it she'd had in years, and she did not try to make it go away. "It leans," she said. "The pan was uneven," Claire said. "The icing is generous. I didn't know how much to use." "It's perfect," Margaret said. She said it before she thought about whether to say it, which meant she meant it in the way that counted. Clara looked satisfied in the way she looked satisfied when her stitches came right. Not triumphant, just accurate, like something had met the standard she'd set for it. They ate the cake at breakfast, which was not when cake was traditionally eaten, but was when they had it, and the lopsided slices were better than they looked, and Duff ate 2 pieces without comment, which was his version of a standing ovation. There was a morning in late August when Margaret woke before 4 and lay in her room for a while before she understood that what had woken her was the quality of the light. Not darkness. The specific quality of dark that means the dark is nearly done. She lay there listening to the ranch in its early stillness, and she thought about the train platform in December, She thought about it in the way you think about a place you have been that no longer feels like where you are, with a kind of distance that isn't coldness, but is the natural result of traveling. You look back and the place is real, and what happened there is real, and it made you the specific shape you currently are. And also you have moved, and the distance is not a betrayal of what happened there, but simply the evidence that you didn't stay. She got up. She put on her coat over her nightgown because the August morning still carried cold this far north, and she walked through the dark house to the kitchen, and she stood at the window above the wash basin and watched the sky begin its shift toward morning. The suitcase was still in her room. She had not moved it. She thought sometimes about putting it somewhere out of the way, up in the loft storage perhaps, or in the hall chest, but she decided to leave it where it was. Not because she might need it, but because she wanted to see it every day and have it mean something different every day than it had meant on the platform. It had been a symbol of departure. Now it was a symbol of arrival. Those were the same object, the same brown case with the brass latches, carrying the same weight. What had changed was the direction. She made coffee. She stood with it at the window and watched the light come in and thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known in December. Not the large things, the ranch, the people, the life that had opened up in the space that the platform had tried to close. But the smaller things underneath those, the ones that had required all the large things in order to become clear. She knew that worth was not something bestowed. She'd believed that once, not consciously, not in the way you believe something you've chosen to believe, but in the bone-deep way of something absorbed so young you don't remember absorbing it. She'd believed that worth was what other people decided you had, that if enough people turned away, the turning away was accurate information about you rather than about them. Robert Ellis's voice, and then Phyllis Crane's letter, and then Edna Marsh on the platform, each one had confirmed something she'd been afraid was true. What she knew now was that she'd been a capable, necessary, stubborn, imperfect person in December, and she was a capable, necessary, stubborn, imperfect person in August. And the difference was not in the person. The difference was in who was looking. She knew that a single person willing to look honestly could change the frame of an entire life. Not because Caleb Whitmore was extraordinary. He was, in fact, a man of ordinary virtues, stubbornness and practicality, and a bedrock decency he never called by any name, but because he had stopped. Because stopping mattered. Because in a world that moved past you without looking back, the one person who turned around was the whole story. And she knew, this one she held most carefully, the way you hold the thing you trust least to survive being said out loud, that it was not too late, that 58, 59, whatever age the calendar currently insisted she was not the number that determined whether a life had space in it for more. She had believed, somewhere behind her practical surface, that she had used up her portion of beginning again, that you got a certain number of those and she had spent hers. She had been wrong. Wrong in the specific and useful way that requires everything that has happened to you to demonstrate the error. She heard footsteps in the hall, Caleb, from the sound of them, his particular tread, the weight distribution she'd come to know. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her at the window. He was not surprised. He'd learned that she was often up before the house, but there was something in the early morning version of him, unhidden by the day's practical concerns, that was different from the daytime, more visible somehow, more himself. "Coffee's ready," she said. He came and got a mug and stood beside her at the window. Outside, the sky was going from gray to something with color in it. The mountains were beginning to define themselves against the light. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "About the workshop. About what you're building over there." He looked at the window rather than at her. "There's a woman in the East Settlement, I heard from the Peterson boy, whose husband left in March. She's alone with 2 children and a claim she doesn't know how to manage." "I've heard about her," Margaret said. "Ruth Kavanaugh mentioned her." "She might need more than what you can do in a Thursday session." Margaret looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. "There's a room above the workshop," she said carefully. "The loft. It would need flooring, but the structure's there." "I know. Duff could do the flooring. I know that too." She looked at the window. "That would be a different thing than a twice-weekly workshop. That would be—" "I know what it would be," he said. I'm telling you, I think it should be." She was quiet for a moment. "Caleb, you understand this would change what the ranch is, what you are, in this town." "I know what I am in this town," he said, without heat. "I've known it for 22 years. He picked up his coffee. "I'm a rancher who made a decision last December that some people thought was questionable, and that turned out to be the best decision I'd made in a long time. My credibility in this community is, I would say it's currently strong." A pause. "I'd rather spend it on something worth spending it on." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the mountains going pink in the early light, the way they did in summer mornings, the specific pink of dawn on snow-capped rock that Margaret had woken up to for 8 months now and still found herself stopping for. "All right," she said. He nodded. They stood there for a while with their coffee in the kitchen of the house that was theirs. Because that was what it was now. She had understood this gradually and then completely, the way you understand things that require accumulation. And outside the ranch came slowly alive in the morning light. Later that day, between the morning cattle check and the noon meal, Caleb went out to the east building and stood in the loft space above the workshop and walked its length and width and came back and told Duff what he needed in terms of flooring materials. And Duff said, "About time," which was the fullest sentence he'd produced on the subject. The small wooden sign went up on the guest room door in September. Clara made it herself, with Caleb's help on the lettering, because her handwriting was still better than his, though she was gracious enough not to say so directly. Pinewood, letters carved careful and even. Margaret's room, not guest room, not spare room, not a room waiting to be temporary. She saw it on the morning they put it up, coming down the hall for breakfast and finding it there on the door, and she put her hand on it for a moment, feeling the letters under her fingers. Clara was watching from the kitchen doorway. Caleb was at the table, pointedly not watching, which was how he looked at things that mattered. "Do you like it?" Clara asked. "Yes," Margaret said. "I practiced the letters 12 times before I did the real one." "I can tell," Margaret said. "They're right." She took her hand off the sign and went to help with breakfast, and the morning went on the way mornings go when they are ordinary, which is to say fully, which is to say the best possible way. And the brown suitcase with the brass latches sat beside the bed in Margaret's room, and the dust on it was thicker now, and she did not open it. She did not open it because what it had been waiting to hold, every goodbye, every departure, every night on a bench or a parlor floor or a too-brief room above somewhere, had been replaced by something that didn't need packing. You spend enough years carrying the weight of other people's decisions about who you are, and you forget that those decisions were never yours to carry in the first place. You forget that the story being told about you by people who do not know you is not the story of you. You forget, somewhere deep in the place where real belief lives, that your worth is not a number that other people calculate and hand back to you. It is a fact that exists independent of who is willing to see it. The forgetting takes a long time to undo. It does not undo all at once. It undoes in the daily accumulation of being seen accurately, by a child learning to stitch, by a man who stops when everyone else walks past, by the women at the long table learning what they need in order to manage their own lives, by the face in the mirror of a woman who has stopped looking for reasons to leave. 58 years old on a train platform in December, with a worn suitcase and nowhere to go, and a lifetime of having been told she was too much of one thing and not enough of another, Margaret Ellis had been exactly who she had always been. The same hands that had kept Thomas alive through 2 years of illness. The same mind that had kept accurate books when no one thought she could. The same stubbornness that had gotten George Talbot up from a snowdrift when his body had already made its decision. She had not become someone different. She had simply arrived somewhere that could see who she already was. And sometimes, not always, not easily, not without cost, that is enough to change everything.